Hey everybody, this is the stuff at the beginning, the preface and stuff of Critique of Competitive Freedom and the Bourgeois-Democratic State, outline of a form-analytic extension of Marx's Uncompleted System by Michael Eldred. It has an appendix by Michael Eldred, Marnie Hanlon, Lucia Kleiber, and Mike Roth. This was published by the Sydney Constance Project, published in 1984. This book is it's an important book, but it's referenced in Marx Worldwide. So, by Jan Hoff. I do want to read this book in its entirety at one point. But for right now, I'm just going to read the preface. Just to kind of have a feel of what the contents of the book are. So, speaking of contents, let's read the table of contents. 2010 preface, 1984 synopsis, 1984 preface, preliminaries, section 1, Marxian system fragment, its reconstruction and extension. 2. General methodological remarks. 3. Value form analytic reconstruction of capital analysis. 4. The analysis of competitive freedom. 5. The analysis of the bourgeois democratic state. Part 1. Introduction. The analysis of the revenue form. Section 1. Elements of labor and loan relations in capitalist labor process. Section 2, the wage relation. Section 3, the leasing of land. Section 4, money capital and means of labor. Section 5, the entrepreneur's temporary possession of revenue sources. Section 6, profit of enterprise. Section 7, incomes and the troika formula. Section 8, mystifying facticity of the revenue form. Section 9, the four classes. Part 2 of the book, the forms of competition. Section 10, the analysis of the circulation process. Summary. Section 11, the entrepreneur's individual subject. The realization of the entrepreneurial will in the firm, the four income sources. Section 12, entrepreneurial freedom. Section 13, the subjects of competition. Section 14, the income sources as property, competitive freedom and abstract will. Section 15, income as property. Section 16, property and commodities, transfer of ownership. Section 17, ownership and the firm's assets. Section 18, the sale of land as change of ownership. Section 19, non-alienability of the laborer. Section 20, the firm is fictitious capital, goodwill. Section 21, the right of property is freedom. Section 22, contract. Section 23, free subjective action and compulsion of competition. Section 24, abstract equality and conflict of property owners. Section 25, the property form as social framework of competition. Part 3, the competitive struggle. Part A of Part 3, competition between firms. Section 26, the entrepreneur as organizer of the firm. Section 27, wages of enterprise, maximization of gross valorization. Section 28, lowering unit costs by increasing effectivity. Section 29, decreasing turnover time, advertising, and market share. Section 3, entrepreneurial choice of branch. Section 31, fixed capital as resistance to change of branch, tendency towards equalization of the rate of profit. Section 32, entry to a branch. Section 33, monopoly, oligopoly, and collusion. Section 34, buying, selling, and loan prices. Section 35, merger and takeover, the collective entrepreneur. Section B, the competition between entrepreneurs and money capitalists. Section 36, accumulation and concentration of capital, the share company and the shareholder, dividend share loan capital. Section 37, the share company is collective will of the shareholders. Section 38, shareholders meeting, directors fees. Section 39, interest rate on loan capital. Section 40, the loan period. Section 41, bankruptcy and the risk premium. Section 42, the company's employment of loan capital. Section 43, interlocking dictatorships and finance capital. Part C, the struggle over privatized nature between the companies and the landowners. Section 44, ground rent is, quote, extra profit. Section 45, monopoly rent and absolute rent. Section 46, basic rent and differential rents 1 and 2. Section 47, fixed capital investments on the land. Section 48, fixed capital investments on the land, advantage to the company. Section 49, resolution of the strife over fixed capital investments. Section 50, land speculation. Section 51, destruction of nature. Section 52, the landowner's freedom with a piece of nature. Part D, the struggle between the companies and the laborers. Section 53, company hierarchy and managers. Section 54, alienated activities, supervision and power structure. Section 55, control of the laborers through machinery and management science. Section 56, the wage form. Section 57, wage differentials. Section 58, conditions of labor. Section 59, the trade union. Section 60, workers' participation, the cooperative. Section E, the person. Part E, the person. Section 61, overexploitation of the laborers, negative right to existence. Section 62, the negative right to existence and capital. Section 63, equal exploitation of the laborers. Section 64, the person is culmination of competitive freedom, self-consciousness of the isolated individual. Section F, contradictions in the reproduction of the free competitive economy. Part F, contradictions in the reproduction of the free competitive economy. Section 65, the free competitive economy, material reproduction without a conscious social subject, disproportionalities. Section 66, absolute overaccumulation. Section 67, relative overaccumulation. Section 68, destruction of capital. Section 69, increase in the organic composition of capital. Section 70, unemployment, the economic cycle. Part 4, the doubling of competitive society into civil society and state. Section 71, competitive society. Section 72, the will to be acknowledged as person. Section 73, wrong. Section 74, the first determination of the outer state. Section 75, law. Section 76, the doubling of competitive society into civil society and state. Section 77, state as repressive apparatus based on rule of law. Section 78, the rule of law and the process of valorization. Section 79, the successful and the unsuccessful. Section 80, income as universal means of existence, the consumer. Section 81, the positive right to existence. Section 82, the welfare state. Section 83, taxation and the autonomous material of the state. Section 84, state economic policy, the positing of universal well-being. Section 85, state monetary policy. Section 86, state subsidies and state enterprises. Section 87, state as promoter of capital accumulation. Section 88, state as promoter of science and education. Section 89, state intervention in industrial strife. Section 90, state sovereignty, national interest, foreign politics. Section 91, international competition and foreign investment. Section 92, imperialism, first world and third world. Section 93, international competition and ecological destruction. Section 94, execution of the universal will of state, the bureaucracy. Section 95, corruption in state officials. Section 96, assured income and career path of state officials. Section 97, recapitulation, the state's attempt to reconcile universality with particularity. Section 98, the doubling, private universality. Section 99, subjugation of civil society and private life to the state. Section 10, pressure of coalitions on the outer state. Section 101, the gulf between state and society. Section 102, bridging the gulf, inner or bourgeois-democratic state. Section 103, state will as will of the people, the citizen. Section 104, election of members of civil society to the universal. Section 105, Parliament, the legislative arm of the state. Section 106, public discussion and parliamentary proceedings. Section 107, government and ministers, deliberation and action. Section 108, political parties, the opposition, professional politics. Section 109, the compromise of class forces and the government. Section 110, disinterest and apathy, the apolitical citizen. Section 111, political public life, the media. Section 112, freedom of the press, expression of political opinion. Section 113, competition between political opinions in Parliament. Section 114, political bribes and scandals, legitimacy crisis. Section 115, the free West and the unfree East. Section 116, statesmen and the citizens' opinion in foreign politics. Section 117, protection of civil society from state power. Section 118, separation of powers, independence of judges. Section 119, the Constitution, the upper and lower house. Section 120, the Constitutional Court. Section 121, referenda, the citizens' affirmation of the diremption of universality and particularity. Okay, so that appears to be the end of the table of contents of the book proper. Now we're on to appendixes. Appendix, a value form analytic reconstruction of capital. Part A, the analysis of commodities and monies. Section 1, industrial commodity products of labor. Section 2, the universal exchange relation of commodities, bracketing of money, mediation, pre-monetary commodities, expanded exchange schema, exchange values. Section 3, abstract associating of concrete dissociated labors. Section 4, the value substance, abstractly associated labor, social form of labor, universality and particularity. Section 5, the expanded expression of value, relative value, form and equivalent form of value, value as potentiality. Section 6, value as actuality, money, doubling of the pre-monetary commodity into price-determinate commodity and money, singularity, ideal and realized price, money, expression of value, commodity and money forms of value. Section 7, immediate exchangeability and means of circulation, absolute value. Section 8, magnitude of value. Section 9, determinations of commodity money. Part B, the capital wage-labor relation. Section 10, the commodity producer, production of industrial commodities. Section 11, the wage labor and the wage form of value. The capitalist loan relation, hiring or of labor power, element of production, means of purchase and of payment, labor process, capital relation, capitalist and working class, class relation. Section 12, articles of individual consumption. Section 13, surplus value, class antagonism, and the contradiction between labor and capital. Part C, capitalist commodity production. Section 14, the surplus value producing process, necessary value, product and labor time, surplus value, product and labor time, rate of surplus value and of exploitation of labor power. Section 15, absolute and relative surplus value production. Section 16, sources of increases in productivity. Section 17, cooperation, organizational, laboring structure, division of labor, organizational science, the subjective factor in the production process. Section 18, means of production, raw materials and the means of labor, machinery, old value, productive consumption, use value, new value. Section 19, relative and absolute surplus value production combined, natural science and technology, the objective factor in the production process. Section 20, absolute and relative residual surplus value production. Section 21, land and rent, landholder, profit, landholding class. Section 22, improvement to the land not requiring renewal. Section 23, valorization of advanced capital, rate of profit, costs. Part D, the interest form of value. Section 24, loaned money and interest. Section 25, gross and net valorization, interest yield and profit of enterprise, rate of net valorization. Section 26, circuits of interest-bearing and of functioning capital, fetishism. Section 27, money capitalists and entrepreneurs, money capitalists and entrepreneurial classes. Section 28, real and fictitious capital, capitalization, rent-bearing capital. Part E, the revenue form. Section 29, elements of capitalist production process. Section 30, revenues, revenue sources, and the source of capitalist, the surface of capitalist economy. Section 31, forms of distribution of value, inversion, revenues as components of value. Section 32, the Troika formula. Section 33, the four classes. Section 34, everyday consciousness as fetishistic reasoning. Part F, the circulation process of capital. Section 35, production and circulation time, commodity, money, and productive capital, stages in the circuit of capital. Section 36, division of capital, spheres of capital, turnover. Section 37, number of parts of capital. Section 38, fixed capital, resting and circulating fixed capital, latent capital, depreciation fund, circulating capital. Section 39, original capital, additional capital, continuous and discrete products. Section 40, labor of circulation, unproductive labor, circulation laborers. Section 41, means of circulation, fixed and circulating, circulation capital, production capital. Section 42, circulation cost, mystification of the valorization process, circuit of cost, turnover. 43, original capital and additional capital, functioning capital. 44, preservation of old value and price changes in the means of production. 45, fixed capital turnover and increases in productivity. 46, original and additional annual capital, annual functioning capital, annual profit of enterprise, annual net profit rate. Section 47, mystification of the capital relation through the multitude of costs. Section 48, increases in the annual net profit rate, cost reduction and acceleration of turnover. Section 49, ground form capital, industrial and commercial capital, merchant, commodity dealing, and money dealing capital. Section 50, three types of functioning capital, expression of value and intermediate selling prices. Section 51, the bank, deposits and depositors. Section 52, bank account, bank balance, giro money, check. Section 53, bank credit, overdraft, the credit system. Section 54, commercial credit, bill of exchange, cash and credit price. Section 55, banknote, overdraft, discounting of bills. Section 56, the banks as creators of giro money. What the hell is giro money? Wikipedia says a gyro transfer, often shortened to gyro, is a payment transfer between current bank accounts and initiated by the payer, not the payee. The debit card has a similar model. Gyros are primarily used in Europe, although electronic payment methods exist in the United States, e.g. the automated clearinghouse. It is not possible to perform third-party transfers with them. In the European Union, the single euro payments area allows electronic gyro or debit card payments in euros to be executed to any euro bank account in the area. End footnote. Or, back to the text. Part G, the reproduction process of capital. Section 57, reproduction of the aggregate social capital. Section 58, departments of commodity production. Section 59, distinctions among laborers and landholders. Distribution of the total commodity product via the mediation of money. Section 60, reproduction of individual capitals. Section 61, value relations between sectors of the total system of reproduction. Section 62, social reproduction of fixed capital. Section 53, accumulation and expanded reproduction. Section 64, the reproduction of the value forms of the capital relation and class relations. Then Table of Contents, 1984 edition. Appendix, Table of Contents, 1984 edition. Abbreviations, bibliography, name index, notes. (2010) Preface. It would be easy to point to weaknesses in this work by the young Eldred, and detractors will enjoy doing that, but there are the strengths too, attributable also to my co-authors of the appendix, which justify making the 1984 edition available in an amended, digitized version to comprehensively reassert in 2010 the insights of value form analysis. No one will want to accuse this work of being infected by the tweedy complacency of academia, nor does it cater to the needs of politically, ideologically motivated readers who tend to want, quote, applicable, unquote, results without bothering with the issues for thinking. The year 1984 was the tail end of a period of intense interest in Marx on the part of youth in Australia and West Germany. In Australia, this interest took the form of a reception of structural Althusserian Marxism, whereas in West Germany it manifested itself especially in reading and research groups around Marx's critique of political economy. As a young Australian research student in philosophy and well tolerated by my PhD supervisor, Georgi Marcus, I joined these West German discussions in 1976, being initiated into all things Marx's Capital by Mike Roth. Only in 1984, after completing work on my dissertation, did I come across Heidegger. He persuaded me that I had to learn ancient Greek to get to the deepest philosophical questions. Heidegger's phenomenological readings of Aristotle and Plato opened my eyes for ontology explicitly, beyond the implicit understanding I had gleaned from reading the dialectical thinkers, Hegel and Marx. It gradually became apparent that form analysis was another name for ontology, and that Marx's value form analysis was nothing other than the key to a social ontology of capitalist society. Heidegger and Marx can be made to communicate via the detour of a phenomenological and ontological reading of the fifth book of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle, on which Heidegger offers no commentary, but to which Marx refers crucially in the first chapter of Das Kapital when dealing with the value form. Thus can cross-fertilization happen. The exchange and distribution of goods is the core theme of the fifth Nicomachean Ethics, and whose goods comprise not only useful material things, but the immaterial good of esteem. Hence, a connection between the constitution of commodity value and exchange and the mutual estimation of human beings becomes visible, especially through the interchange of human abilities. The phenomenological interpretation of this connection culminated in my book, Social Ontology, published in 2008. One second. Sorry, I'm trying to get to the notes here. Notes to the 2000. Yeah, that's at Michael Eldred, Social Ontology, recasting political philosophy through a phenomenology of who-ness. And footnote. To unfold a phenomenology of the power play of mutual estimation amounts to a socio-ontology of who-ness. Footnote: a phenomenology of who-ness could be regarded as a surrogate for the projected analysis of the bourgeois private sphere. See Michael Eldred's book Der Mann, Geschlecht, ontologischer Auslegungsversuch der phallologischen Ständigkeit Haag. I don't know. That's the book title. End footnote. But back to my 1984 book. The value form is already ontological, as signaled by the term, quote, form. In the realm of social ontology, the value form is perhaps the ontological concept par excellence, because it conceptualizes a fundamental form of association, Vergesellschaftung, which is at the same time an elementary form of social power play. Social power play with its own ontological structure that differs in essence from the ontological structure of productive power focused on by Heidegger. The late Marx can therefore be read as the thinker who worked out and presented in fine detail the complex ontological structure of capitalist economy. At the heart of this structure is value as a power play. The Sidney Constance project's endeavor to reconstruct capital, Marx's capital, systematically and venture beyond it to the realms of the state and the private sphere under the guidance of a critical reading of Hegel's Lex philosophy, therefore amounts to an explicit, detailed presentation of that total historical socio-ontological constellation called capitalist society. Writing in the late 1970s and early 1980s, I imbibed the zeitgeist of those new left times in which the issue of overcoming capitalism in favor of a non-Stalinist, democratic, or even libertarian socialism was on the agenda. Today I do not advocate any kind of socialism, and that not because I have become older, wiser, mellower, conservative, and resigned, but for philosophical reasons. The sundering of universality from particularity in the value form is the leitmotif pervading my attempt at a social ontology of capitalist society, and the historical possibility of its practical overcoming forms the backdrop that envisages a conscious association replacing non-conscious reified association. Socialist humanity is to become the ultimate underlying subject of society and the movements of social life. Human being is thus thought as subjectivity within a metaphysics or ontology of subjectivity. People in the plurality of some kind of politically constituted, quote, we, whether it be in a more or less centralized state with democratic institutions, a structure of workers' councils, or whatever, are to become as, quote, freely associated producers, end quote, the subjects of social life. The dominant medium of association is thus to become consciously political, democratic in the stead of reified competitive gain-seeking association via the various value forms. The proper name for human beings in such a competition, as I now see in retrospect, is not subjects of competition, but rather players in the gainful game. Players in the gainful game. Footnote. See Michael Eldred's article, Capital and Technology, Marx and Heidegger, published in Left Curve, number 24, May 2000. End footnote. These players are free individuals exercising their various powers and abilities in an interplay with one another. With an overcoming in socialism of reified association, Überwindung, Verdinglichter, Vergesellschaftung, people themselves purportedly are to become, quote, truly free on a higher plane of association than that enabled by bourgeois private property. The dream of a democratic socialism, however, is driven by a totalizing way of thinking that is out to collectively set up and control social living as a whole, and is therefore a precipitate in the socio-political realm of what Heidegger calls the setup, parenthesis, Gestell, and parenthesis. Since people are a plurality, the political democratic association of living together can only come about as ongoing political power struggle. Instead of mutually beneficial agreed exchanges on the many different competitive markets and economic power struggle, socialist living must consist of endless, all-engulfing political power struggles on all levels. This amounts to the end of the individual as such, who is socio-ontologically possible only in conjunction with the state-protected, reified forms of association emanating from money, which translates as private property. Today, I therefore affirm rather than question that, quote, individual freedom without private property is impossible, unquote. The value form of money and the other value forms derived from money have historically enabled the individual and individual freedom in the West. That is, the free individual is a definite historical form of association and not some kind of imagined individual living in a pre-social, quote, state of nature, end quote. With the striving for a democratic socialism or for social democracy, the free individual has to be overcome and subjugated to a politically constituted social, quote, we. It is to lose its garden of privacy for the reified social power afforded by the value forms is to be overridden by the political, democratically organized, conflictual will. Politics becomes hegemonic, primary, all-pervasive. With the overcoming of free human individuality, however, freedom per se is socially eradicated. Anything resembling, quote, libertarian socialism, end quote, is a contradictio in ejecto. The free human individual can flourish only where it can be also private, i.e. where it is guaranteed protection from the incursions of a political plurality, a democratic, quote, we, and, quote, institutionalized in the legitimate power structures of some kind of state. The criticisms of individualistic egoism and individualistic consumerism from the left point indeed to deficiencies in desiring human being itself, which is ever seeking its individual advantage, but association via incessant political power struggles in any kind of democratic socialism by no means remedies these deficiencies. Self-seeking is merely displaced from the striving to gain income, reified social power, to the striving for influence within political institutions of power that be, including democratic, economic, and workers' management councils. The private, free, bourgeois individual metamorphoses into a self-seeking element whose privacy is no longer protected, enmeshed and struggling in a web of overarching, more or less democratic political structures. A social ontology of capitalist democratic society therefore aims, quote, modestly, end quote, at bringing to light the structure of the world as it is. There are certain things which not even the best art, not only philosophical thinking, can show, and there is no foreknowing what will come historically with such deeper insight. The figure of Überwindung, overcoming, getting rid of, is displaced by that of Verwindung, getting over, twisting free of. Instead of striving to overcome reified value form association, practically, politically, philosophical insight into reified association and its necessary adjunct in the bourgeois democratic institutions enables a distancing in the way of thinking, Denkart, from the gainful game of striving for income, from the endless political power struggles within the democratic institutions, and also from the unreflected striving for social status as someone who, as some who, but not in favor of entering another way of thinking that is out to politically, collectively set up and govern social living. Such distancing is a getting over that, even whilst daily living continues to require engagements in power struggles, preserves those precious private interstices and niches in which individual freedom, both shared and solitary, can thrive in spite of all. That's some wild shit. Michael Eldred, Cologne, February 2010. "1984 synopsis. This work grew out of a research project on the reconstruction of the various drafts to Marx's critique of political economy. Four of us, Roth, Kleiber, Hanlon, and Eldred, have arrived at a form-analytic reconstruction of Marx's Capital, reproduced here in the appendix, which forms the indispensable conceptual basis for the present work. Part 1 summarizes provisionally some of the principal categories of the capital analysis. It cannot replace the development provided in the appendix, by way of providing a transition to the analysis of the, quote, surface of capitalist economy, end quote, parts 2 and 3. The principal form-analytic categories of the competition analysis are those of property, person, and subject of competition. These are developed through a consideration of the subjective activity of individuals in relation to the pre-given value form determinant capitalist economic objectivity. The subject of competition is the bearer of competitive freedom, the overarching concept of the competition analysis, whose contradictoriness is to be laid bare. Part 4 investigates the universal social subject which necessarily complements the competitive economy. The state, too, is conceptualized in relation to the form-determinate contradictory freedom of the bourgeois epoch as realization of freedom. The principal figure of the total analysis from the beginning of the capital analysis is a dialectical one, the diremption of the abstract universal from the particular. This diremption is first constituted in the double character of bourgeois labor, conceptualized in the value form analysis. The figure recurs again and again as the inner band, which, in reality, for thinking consciousness, connects the bourgeois forms of society into a contradictory totality. The claim of the present work that our present form of society constitutes a totality can only be validated by thinking in a system. On the various levels of the analysis, right up to its crescendo, in the investigation of democratic institutions, the contents of everyday consciousness are taken into account in order to demonstrate to it that the various aspects of contemporary life are only lived out as modes of expression of the underlying essential contradiction. 1844 premise, preliminaries. Why Marx? Why philosophy at all? The same ground which has prevented philosophy from withering away has also kept the first scientific socialist alive. Philosophy lives on, decrepit, in the learned institutions. It occupies itself with the past and with epistemology, in which contents come forward, mishandled as case studies. Here and there it is able to maintain a flicker of vitality in those questions which give it birth, quote, teachings about correct living, end quote, Adorno. For those who have not swum with the tide of the dissolution of philosophy in the empirical social sciences, philosophy has maintained a fascination, even in connection with the attempt to come to grips with our contemporary life, and not as mere escape from life. Marx has a reputation as a philosopher and is read by some of those interested in philosophy. Marx's status as, quote, scientific socialist, end quote, is a draw card in the political arena rather than for students of philosophy. The latter are often attracted to philosophy because philosophy is precisely not science, at least not in the sense of the natural sciences. Marx lets himself be misused by those with an allergy against any form of science, who want to find philosophical inspiration in a free and easy manner, without the irksome constriction of rigorous thought fetters. Their conception of philosophy borders on what everyday understanding often means by philosophy: wild, fanciful, subjective ideas without practical application. Marx has suffered his ups and downs in his career as the originator of Marxism. At present, Marx's popularity is at a fairly low ebb. For over a decade, some Marxists have spoken of a, quote, crisis of Marxism, end quote. Footnote. See, for example, Alex Kalinikos, 1982, Stanley Aronowitz, 1981, Louis Althusser, 1979, G.H.R. Parkinson, 1982, Paul Sweezy, 1979, R.L. Heilbronner, I think it's Robert Heilbronner, Russell Jacoby, P. Patton, 1983, M. Campioni and E. Gross, 1983, Agazzi, 1983, and M. Hanlon, 1983. In popular understanding and in some more serious interpretations of Marx, he is represented as the thinker who made various prophecies, including that of the, quote, inevitability of socialism, end quote. The agent of this, quote, historical mission, end quote, was to have been the proletariat. One can doubtless find evidence for this interpretation of Marx in his writings. Elements of the Hegelian philosophy of history found their way, with a radical return to the left, into Marx's thinking. The comparison of these optimistic elements of a philosophy of history with the course of history in the 20th century has provided a childishly simple way of settling accounts with this revolutionary. A scientist whose predictions turn out to be wrong is obviously a quack, a mere idealistic soothsayer. With this judgment, many have saved themselves the trouble of gaining a closer acquaintance with Marx. Others have read some Marx with this idée fixe in mind, or idée fixe, I don't know how to say that word, I-D-E-E-F-I-X-E, in mind, which has prevented them coming to any fruitful understanding of the left Hegelian. Enlightened consciousness today, in contrast to the hopeful thinking of socialists, especially in Germany, up until the 30s, knows that history does not stand on our side, that it was a bad joke to talk of a, quote, objective necessity, end quote, of the proletariat reaching revolutionary consciousness. This enlightened consciousness is also cynical. It sees that, since the proletariat has failed to fulfill its prescribed historical mission, that we must make the best of things and set aims more modest than that of a socialist revolution. That is indeed one way out of a dilemma. The knowledge that we cannot rely on the current of history to move us forward is given a twist towards the affirmative. If history will not move us forward, then we should let ourselves be swirled along in its eddies. The graffito, quote, only dead fish swim with the stream, end quote, makes a poignant point against this kind of resigned thinking. In the reified society, it is all too easy to allow things to have their way. This is one aspect of fetishized thinking. Everyday life is profuse with the compulsion of things, of the necessity of bowing to externally given circumstances. Marx's theory can be interpreted as a conceptualization of these, quote, externally given circumstances, end quote, of the, quote, compulsion of things, end quote, apparently independent of human will. This conceptualization should be able to point the way forward by showing the fulcrum where collective subjectivity could overcome reified relations and become subject of its own history. A century of Marxism has left a sorry record behind. The world has not become socialist. Real existing socialism has been dubbed by the Free West a, quote, totalitarian, end quote, system, and that not entirely without justification. Although with this designation, the West follows its own insidious, tendentious aims. Just as a side note, totalitarianism is absolutely not something that is restricted to like liberals or conservatives, but is used quite liberally by people like Trotsky, Victor Serge, and others. Critical theories which have abandoned any association with the aim of a socialist revolution have been born and have gained a following. From the fact that socialism has not been realized, these theories propose that one had better give up the idea altogether. In doing so, they take leave of the problematic circumscribed by Marx and Hegel, which is directed at a dialectical theory of the totality in the totality's contradictoriness. The totality is pronounced to be ineluctable, or even evolutionarily advantageous for humankind. The category of contradiction is relegated to the status of a Hegelian residue in Marx, smacking of idealism, whose retention can only hinder the development of critical thinking. The critics of dialectical theory are right in one point. The dialectical aspects of Marx's theory have to date not become a political force. The party in which Marx and Engels had the greatest direct influence, German social democracy, never at any time embodied the radical politics implied by the dialectical aspects of Marx's theory. Footnote, see Oscar Necht, 1983. End footnote. Instead, it was the evolutionist aspects in Marx and Engels which caught the imagination of social democracy and allowed it a comfortable path. The evolutionist Marx is also the exoteric Marx, who admits of an uninvolved interpretation conducive to contemporary Marx reconstructors, among other things. The dialectical Marx remains hidden behind the evolutionist Marx, who employs a, quote, logical, historical, unquote, mode of argumentation in his main work, and thereby gives credence to a Marxist, quote, science of history, unquote. Marx himself was responsible for this popularized version of his theory, in that he modified his dialectical presentation increasingly to a, quote, logical, historical, unquote, theory. Above all, Marx wanted to have a political effect with his theory. Although Marx states in several places that he never made compromises to vulgar understanding, the way his work was received gave him cause to think twice, to avoid further disappointment. The critique of 1859 did not exactly take the world by storm. Quote, Biscamp himself said to me, he doesn't see the, quote, A quabon, A with an accent, Q-U-O-I, space B-O-N, unquote. I expected attacks or criticism, but not to be fully ignored, which must also significantly impair sales, in America. The first book has been extensively discussed by the entire German press from New York to New Orleans. I'm afraid only that it is held to be too theoretical for the working public there. End quote. Marx to Engels, it looks like July 22nd, 1859. Marx to LaSalle, November 6, 1859. Such reactions no doubt moved Marx to, quote, popularize as much as possible, unquote. Preface to the first edition of Capital, a deeper ground for the popularizations, which are simultaneously historicizing vulgarizations, is Marx's own, quote, methodological unsureness, end quote. Despite the imperturbable calm with which Marxists talk of, quote, Marx's materialist method, end quote. Backhaus, 1981. The quote from Backhaus was the methodological unsureness. What could be more popular than a theory which implies that history, in the last instance, is on our side? If a dialectical theory is to reveal the contradictoriness of the peculiar object, which is to be superseded and annulled, if at all, by the conscious act of a revolutionary subject. An evolutionary theory lightens the task considerably by suggesting that the revolutionary subject has only to release the trip lever in history to unleash the potential inherent in the historical development brought about by capitalism. The ripened fruit needs only to be plucked from the tree, and conversely, one has to sit back and wait for the fruit to ripen. With the critique of the teleological tendentiousness of an evolutionary theory, Marxism could regard itself as having freed itself from a pernicious illusion. This liberation would lead, if constantly pursued, to an unearthing of the esoteric, quote, dialectical, unquote, Marx, whose critical potential has never, in the relatively long history of Marxism, been realized. As the debate in and around Marxism now stands, the, quote, dialectical Marx remains unpopular, one could say, almost completely unknown and disregarded. Instead, the evolutionary Marx has been cut down to size. There is no necessary evolution towards socialism, but one can employ some Marxian categories in a, quote, science of history, unquote, or a, quote, critical sociology, unquote, of social change. This capitulation of critical theory to historiography and sociology is not without its sociological explanations, which do not interest us here. Some have remained committed socialists politically and pursue a Marxist sociology or historiography in theoretical endeavor. With words, one can only ever achieve so much. Nevertheless, the words contained in the following pages are placed to stem the tide in Marxism and all theories with critical pretensions. A perilous enterprise, considering the fury with which some waves thunder into a shore and the mighty undertow of ancient sluggish undercurrents. The thesis is the following: only a dialectical theory can be critical. All else, on closer inspection, turns out to be froth and foam. This claim can only be evaluated by studying the entire presentation offered here. New section, Section 1, the Marxian system fragment, its reconstruction and extension. Quote, the work concerned is a critique of economic categories, or if you like, the system of bourgeois economy critically presented. It is simultaneously a presentation of the system and through the presentation a critique of the system. ... The whole is divided into 6 books. 1 on capital, contains some preliminary chapters, 2 on landed property, 3 on wage labor, 5 on state, 5 international trade, 6 world market. I can of course not avoid taking critical notice of other economists occasionally, especially polemics against Ricardo, ... End quote. Marx to LaSalle, 22nd of February, 1858. With these words, Marx describes, as in several other places, the entire system initially outlined by him in September 1857 during the writing of the introduction to an enormous rough draft. If you don't know what he's referring to, is the Grundrisse. Striking is that the critique is to be performed through presentation of the system, already a hint at dialectics. In March of 1858, Marx writes again to LaSalle, quote, it is in no way my intention to work out all 6 books into which I divide the whole to an equal extent, but rather in the latter 3 to give merely the basic outlines, whereas in the first 3, which contain the basic economic development proper, elaborations are not always to be avoided. ... End quote. Marx to LaSalle, March 11th, 1858. My purpose here is not to investigate in detail the extent to which Marx executed or altered the plan of his system. Instead, I want to make some elementary observations about his planned system as a prelude to outlining a research program which has grown out of the attempt to reconstruct the Marxian drafts to this system. A point which cannot be overemphasized is that the system aims at, quote, critically presenting, end quote, a theoretical object existing in the bourgeois epoch. The system aims at presenting, quote, for the first time, an important view of social relations scientifically, end quote. Marx to LaSalle. 12th of November, 1858. We are thus dealing with a proposed critical science of, quote, bourgeois economy, end quote, including the state. The rough outline of 6 books is elaborated in accordance with the above quoted view that the latter 3 books are only to provide broad strokes in more detailed plans for the first book. To my knowledge, extensive plans for the books on landed property and wage labor do not exist. However, the discussion of the change of plan below. The book on capital has the following structure. A. Capital in general. 1. Production process of capital. 2. Circulation process of capital. 3. Profit and interest. B. The section on competition, quote, or the action of the many capitals on one another, end quote. C. The section on the credit system. D. The section on share capital. Footnote. After Rodosdolsky. 1977, page 12. End footnote. As a rough structure which was only partially filled out with drafts, even this articulation of the first book cannot be regarded as a blueprint strictly to be observed. In particular, the place of competition within the plan for the first book was never concretized with a draft. In the envisaged work to be published, under the title of Capital, only the section on capital in general was to be covered. The plan for 6 books thereby shrinks in the years from 1859, when the Critique was published, to 1863, when work on the drafts for Capital was properly begun, to merely the first section of the first book. In this vein, Marx writes to Kugelmann in December of 1862, the manuscript for Capital, which are yet to be written, are described by Marx simply as the, quote, copying out and final filing down of printing, end quote, of a manuscript entitled On the Critique of Political Economy, written between 1861 and 1863. Quote, it indeed comprises only that which should form the 3rd chapter of the first section, namely, quote, capital in general, end quote. It therefore does not include the competition of the capitals or the credit system. ... It is the quintessence, together with the first part, and the development of the following parts, with the exception perhaps of the relation of the various state forms to the various economic structures of society, could be easily carried out by others on the basis of that already provided. End quote. Marx to Kugelmann. 28th of December, 1862. One could say today that Marx overestimated both his own powers and those of others. Not only did Marx not come to publishing his own theory of, quote, capital in general, but no one else has ever ventured into an extended work on the remaining parts of his system. The reference to the difficulty of working out the relation of the various forms of state to the various economic structures remains enigmatic. According to the editors of the Grundrisse, the most extensive plan for the book on state consists of merely 3 printed lines. Quote, state and bourgeois society, taxes or the existence of the unproductive classes, the state debt, the population, the state towards the outside, ... end quote. Grundrisse. The last mentioned theme belongs already to the 5th book on international trade. With regard to the present work, which has as one of its objects the bourgeois form of state, these remarks by Marx are of no positive help in the contemporary theoretical task of a state theory. The same holds for our work on competition. belonging to the, quote, eventual continuation, end quote, of Marx's Capital. Despite hints in the draft for Volume 3 of Capital, and despite comments on competition in the first volume, see Section 4 below, one is confronted with an autonomous task of research in any contemporary attempt at completing a systematic theory of bourgeois society. No amount of Marx research will be able to uncover what Marx had in mind for the unwritten, even in draft form, parts of his system. The title for the whole system, System of Bourgeois Economy, the references to competition in the rough draft for Volume 3 of Capital, as well as the above-cited plan for the book on state, suggest a rather economic work. The present work diverges from these Marxian intentions in a way to be explained in following subsections of this preface. As to whether Marx ever actually gave up his plan of 6 books extending as far as a theory of state, international trade and world market, the view of Rozdalsky is of interest. Referring to the second detailed plan Marx works on from 1864 to 65 for Capital, Rozdalsky notes that, quote, these books, parenthesis, the latter 3, end parenthesis, Michael Eldred, were never really, quote, given up, end quote. That is, that the themes falling within their area were never assimilated fully into the second structure of the work, but rather remained basically reserved to its, quote, eventual continuation, end quote, Roman Rozdalsky. And for those who don't know, 1864 to 65 work on Capital was for Volume 3 of Capital. This is to be contrasted with the plan changes concerning the first 3 books. The plan for Volume 3 of Capital, which Marx writes to Engels on the April 30th, 1868, suggests the interpretation that at least aspects of the section on competition are incorporated in the treatment of the average rate of profit, and that the books on landed property, wage labor, and, quote, the 3 classes, end quote, referred to in a structure to be found in the Grundrisse, are to gain at least a condensed presentation in the 7th and last part of Capital Volume 3. This last part, containing the investigation of the, quote, 3 revenues, end quote, and their corresponding classes, is to end with, quote, the class struggle as a conclusion in which the movement and dissolution of the whole shit dissolves, ... end quote. It is an undecidable question to what extent this analysis of revenue forms, a draft of which first appears in the 1861 to 63 manuscripts, can be regarded as a modified concretization of the second and third books of the originally planned Marxian system. Footnote. See Schwartz's criticism of Rozdalsky's interpretation of Marx's changes in plan in Schwartz, 1974. Whatever new insights are to be won in future philological investigations of Marx's writings, one must conclude that Marx's project of a critique of bourgeois society, however one may interpret this project, remained unfinished. Indeed, no more than a skeleton. Footnote. Rozdalsky's discussion of Marx's plan and its changes in Rozdalsky 1977, pages 10 to 56. The 7 variants of this plan are given in an overview in Vygotsky, 1967. I have the first chapter of Vygotsky's The Great Discovery on this channel. And footnote. Even the skeleton was left as a mere torso. 2 published volumes, a contribution to the critique of political economy, and Volume 1, in 2 German and 1 French edition prepared by Marx himself, and the, quote, arms and legs, and, quote, of voluminous unpublished manuscripts to Volumes 2 and 3 of Capital, as well as to the historical presentation of the theories of surplus value. Footnote. See I. Glaser, 1982, where a radical thesis for the fragmentary character of capital is presented and defended. And footnote. Footnote. The difficulties lying in the way of producing a publishable version of Marx's capital analysis, which can in any way be regarded as a finished product, are in fact insurmountable. The completeness of the manuscripts, above all the manuscript of Volume 3 written in 1864-65, is attested to by a letter from Marx to Engels written at the time he was preparing the manuscript for Volume 1 for publication. Quote, although ready, the manuscript, enormous in its present form, is unedible by anyone except myself, not even by you, end quote. Marx. As it turned out, Engels became, in spite of this caveat, Marx's editor. And footnote. As for the projected, quote, flesh and blood, end quote, of an analysis of the bourgeois superstructure, alluded to in the notorious 1859 preface, as, quote, the social, political, and spiritual process of life, end quote, not even a systematic plan was left behind by Marx. Footnote. One could question whether such a subject matter is subsumable under a theory described by Marx as the, quote, system of bourgeois economy, end quote. Regardless of this problem of interpretation, it is clear that the famous sentences about social being determining consciousness remain empty and unsubstantiated. Without the theory which conceptualizes what, quote, social being, end quote, and consciousness in the bourgeois form of society are, the critics of the hitherto most influential attempts to formalize these countless unsubstantiated statements, Althusserian Marxism, correctly points to the meaninglessness of phrases such as, quote, determination in the last instance, end quote, and, quote, relative autonomy, end quote. And footnote. In the 1859 preface, which publicly announces the system of 6 books, Marx is misleading about the state of readiness of his work. He claims that, quote, the whole material lies before me in the form of monographs, end quote. Although the last 3 books are scarcely represented in these monographs, comprising excerpt notebooks from the years 1851 to 52 and the rough draft of 1857 to 58, first published in 1939 and 1941 under the title provided by the editors of the Marx-Engels-Lenin Institute in Moscow, Grundrisse der Kritik der politischen Ökonomie. Footnote. See Schrader, 1980. I'm pretty sure that's referring to, I think it's a Fred Schrader. He's written on Marx, but I think he's primarily a Hegel expert. But I think he is a Marxist Hegel expert, or a Marx positive Hegel expert. I'm not sure, though. I could be talking out my hiney hole. That Marx's system remains a fragmentary skeleton has not been seriously taken into account by the Marxist tradition, and especially not by English-speaking Marxism. An index for the infantile state of English-speaking Marx research is that the Grundrisse first appeared in English translation as late as 1873, its publication stimulating the printing of a flurry of articles, which however quickly gave way to boredom with the topic. Under the bland formula, quote, Marx's main work, end quote, Marx's Capital is treated almost without exception as a more or less completed work. This illusion of completeness, with or without the admission that various special themes, such as a theory of capitalist crisis or of the credit system, remain contradictory or incomplete, and the almost total lack of critical evaluation of the one volume published by Marx and other manuscripts to Marx's Capital. Reflect an apparently impenetrable complacency and unwillingness of English-speaking Marxism to immerse itself in the minute details of Marx, not Marxist, research. Even the long and extensive debate on the value theory engaged in by a few Marxists, and followed by a couple more in Britain and the U.S., taps around in the dark or completely ignores the issue of the dialectical character of the esoteric strand in Marx's value theory. I'm not exactly sure, but I think sometimes, this is just an opinion to myself because I'm just thinking out loud, is that, this there's very much an impatience in the left to derive like immediate political consequences from research. And I think a lot of people have the tendency to view the critique of political economy, even though they, claim it as their basis, view it in a certain sense due to its level of abstraction as kind of like playing around in the clouds. That's just a speculation. I don't know if that's actually true, but there's definitely a certain, at least in the English-speaking world, this may not be true of like other places, but in the English-speaking world, a certain kind of like contempt for theory, especially theory that's not about culture, right? People read extremely difficult shit, but not extremely difficult economic shit. But that's just what's the word? Speculation. On my part. Perhaps a perturbing sign for an English-speaking Marxism, which through the experience of the New Left has tried to distance itself from the official Marxism of the Soviet Union, is that at least on the question of there being no need for a minute fundamental reassessment of Marx's system fragment, they are, through either disinterest or dogmatism, in fundamental agreement. The historico-empirical attitude of the mathematico-logical inclinations of English-speaking Marxists have, by and large, precluded any minute and radically uncompromising reevaluation of Marx's writings. In the notes provided by the editors of the Institute for Marxism-Leninism in Moscow and Berlin in the first volume of Capital, the books projected by Marx on state, international trade, and world market are silently written out of even ideal existence. After mentioning the planned 6 books of the 1859 preface, the editors write, quote, in the course of further work, Marx decided to construct his whole, sick, work according to the plan which he had earlier worked out for the section titled Capital in General with its 3 subsections, end quote. This statement partly confirms the interpretation given above of Marx's letter of the 30th of April 1868, according to which the first 3 books are taken up in modified form in the 3 volumes of Capital. Following the last quoted passage is a quotation from a letter from Marx to Kugelmann from the 13th of October 1866, in which Marx refers to his, quote, whole work, end quote, as falling into the structure of the 3 volumes of Capital as published, plus a 4th book, quote, on the history of the theory, end quote. The editors could sensibly put forward the suggestion that Marx, in 1866, had already abandoned any intention of writing the last 3 books of his planned system. They presented the matter with apologetic slyness, however, as if the whole system were now somehow taken up into the 3 books of Capital. The new plan of Marx in any case cannot be represented as bringing new contents under the structure of the analysis of, quote, Capital in general, but as an abandonment of the previous systematic structure. The editors, of course, do not underline the fragmentary character of Marx's Capital itself. To the asserted completed construction of socialism in the Eastern Bloc corresponds the asserted completeness of Marx's system. It is inconceivable that Soviet Marxism questioned the theological underpinnings of the state religion. Although English-speaking Marxism of late vigorously repudiates any uncritical acceptance of the social system in the East, it has not yet shaken through an exacting but rejuvenating reassessment of Marx's critique of political economy the petrified image of a solid foundation of Marxism. In some cases, the stony image is adhered to. In others, a net is cast in entirely new waters. Neither attitude is able Neither attitude is able to bring an ossified Marxism to life. The kind of theory put together by Marxists more often than not resembles the wedding robes of Penelope, who unravels the weaving of the previous day in the night and starts every day afresh. There are ever new facets and events in the phenomenal world which draw the attention of some Marxist theoretician or other and cause him/her to devote energy to an obviously undone task. Why this task is given priority is determined in the first instance by personal interest. When pressed for a justification as to the critical relevance of the study, the answer often runs as follows. Some organization, social movement, or group urgently needs empirical knowledge in some area for their, quote, struggle. Or recourse is taken to the significance of a tradition or author whose standing and relevance remain unquestioned. A Marxist theoretician, like anyone else, cannot jump over his/her own shadow. This fact notwithstanding, one could hope that the question of what critique is and how it relates to socialist revolution, for which the Marxist waits since many years past, could be posed for a Marxist. In the present work, the object of attention is not the Marxian oeuvre itself. The starting point is rather the project of a systematic theory of the bourgeois form of society, which relates directly to Marx insofar as his writings on the critique of political economy form the indispensable theoretical raw material for a reconstructed capital analysis. Marx's theory is the best in a long series of attempts to analyze capitalism. This reconstructed capital analysis, in turn, serves as foundation for a theory of the surface of capitalist economy and of the bourgeois superstructure. There is already a marked change of accent from Marx's intentions in that not the, quote, system of bourgeois economy, end quote, is the object of analysis, but rather the totality of the bourgeois form of society. The structure of the total system of which the present work comprises a version of the 5th, 6th, and 8th sections is as follows. 1. Commodities and money. 2. The capital-wage-labor relation and capitalist production. 3. Interest and the revenue form. 4. Circulation and reproduction process of capital. 5. The surface of capitalist economy, competitive freedom and compulsion. 6. The state as Leviathan. 7. Bourgeois subjectivity and private life. 8. The state as expression of the will of the citizens, bourgeois public life and democracy. 9. Culture and aesthetic experience. 10. Ideology and critical social philosophy. The first 4 headings cover the structure of a reconstructed capital analysis contained in the appendix under joint authorship. In following subsections of this preface, a more detailed description of some parts of the system will be given. At first sight, the challenge of offering a contribution to a system appears to be beset with insuperable difficulties. Apart from the general distaste for thinking systematically, the debate in and around Marxism over Marx's system fragment, even 100 years after Marx's death, is marked by severe divergences. There's a couple of footnotes I missed. Footnote 1. A daring attempt at an alternative to Marx's theory is made by Albert and Hanel, 1978, intellectual offspring of the American New Left. I don't know if those are like kind of like quasi-anarchist. Isn't it Michael Albert and like Robert Hanel? They kind of had like they kind of did try to do like they're kind of like market socialist people, like, but like of a more like libertarian bent. I'm not sure. One can wish the adventurous will to break out of the straitjacket of orthodox Marxism will, as well as the perspective which criticizes economism, quote, which dissects one aspect of society, isolating it from the totality, end quote. The positive result, however, is disappointing. The alternative, quote, political economy of praxis, end quote, starts from a formal model in which absolutely everything is crammed in by being assigned a variable within a matrix. The attribution of labels to phenomena is a taxonomic activity useful to stamp collectors and orderly house persons, but falls short of anything which could be called theoretical systematicity. And footnote. Footnote. Another version of these sections has appeared in Roth et al. La Forna-Valeur, or to appear in German under and is to appear in German under the title Die Ghetto-Belte Verdopplung, bracket, was not forthcoming. That's meaning the book was never published in German, end bracket. And footnote. Footnote. The discussion of capital analysis in West Germany has been lively and thoroughgoing. We mention here the works of Backhaus, Krause, Nanninger, Steinfort, Güler, Roth, Glaser, Runzi, Reichelt, Projektgruppe Entwicklung des Marxischen Systems, and Hartmann. And footnote. Footnote. One can take any of the Soviet textbooks on political economy or the work of an orthodox Marxist economist such as Mandel. Other Marxist theorists in non-economic areas of theory, such as Poulantzas and Gramsci, have ignored the theoretical problems of the critique of political economy. Still other vast areas of modern Marxism have no connection whatever with capital analytic categories, notwithstanding that they talk sometimes of laborers, labor power, capital, etc. End footnote. I'm not sure, but there's a similar book called the Unit that seems like similar to what this book is attempting to do, because this book obviously is including the state in its work. There's a book that was recently published by Gerd Reuten, who, it's a shame with a lot of his writings, because maybe I've said this already in the same video, so I don't know if I'm repeating myself, I'm sorry. But it's a really big shame because his writings, and this is true of a lot of like the more detailed work of like a lot of people kind of doing a similar thing to this like reconstruction of the critique of political economy, or some people put less emphasis on the critique, or a systematic representation of the capitalist mode of production. To try to reconstruct Marx, so people like Chris Arthur and Gerd Reuten, and I think you could also say of like the Japanese theorists like Kozo Uno, Tom Sakine, Robert Albritton, John Bell, I think his name is. All those kinds of people try to sort of do like a similar thing. But some of those people, not all of them, but a lot of those people in like their books, like I'd like to read Gerd Reuten's book, but it's like full of equations and shit that don't seem like they're really explained to someone who doesn't know shit about math. So I'm kind of fucked in trying to read it. But anyway, not important now, just a thought I had. The present work does not deal with the disputes around the critique of political economy directly. It is founded on the Sidney Constance Group's reconstruction of capital. See the appendix, which is crystallized out of research and discussion starting with a research project organized by Mike Roth in Constance in 1971. Genuine critique aside, no one will be able to accuse us of putting forward half-baked ideas in our concise reconstruction. Reference will be made throughout in the main text to this reconstruction as well as to Marx's text. Our reconstruction, like all scientific argumentation, is open to criticism. This criticism presupposes, of course, the rare reader who is willing to take the trouble of mastering the argumentation and uncovering any defects therein. The attempt to build on the capital analysis in the areas of competition and the state has shed light also on the fundamental concepts of the capital analysis in connection with the aim of grounding a critique of the bourgeois forms. This form analysis does not seek to, quote, reduce, and quote, superstructural phenomena to economic phenomena, nor to, quote, explain superstructural phenomena causally in terms of economic factors. Instead, it aims at grasping the whole in thought, as laying bare the, quote, inner band, and, quote, constituting this whole, and it's showing in which sense humans are not subjects of their own social life and history and the consequences thereof. The present work is a philosophically oriented critique of two spheres of modern bourgeois reality, not a treatise on economics nor a sociological study. Qualitative form is the focus of attention and not objective economic or other, quote, laws of motion, end quote, which in any case are a hoax. The analysis makes no claim to being able to chart the historical development of bourgeois society. The latter activity of understanding, capital U understanding, is to be contrasted with the speculative, capital R reason of critique, which modern social science thought it had banished forever under a cloud of disgrace. Footnote. See also my article, Material Dialectics and Socialist Politics from 1981, and Eldred et al.'s article, Is Dialectics Dead? Introductory Remarks on Form-Analytic Theory and Politics, to appear in Science and Society, bracket, never published, 2010, end bracket. End footnote. In its fundamental characteristics and through all the immense variation and particularity shown up by bourgeois history, the bourgeois form of society is subject, according to the programmatic claim, to the same essential critique as when Marx published in 1867 the first volume of his theory of the, quote, present society, end quote. In conceiving this work as the second part of a form analysis, I have without doubt diverged from Marx's intention, in capital, of explicating, quote, the economic law of motion of modern society, end quote. There is nevertheless a line of development in Marx's critique of political economy, starting with the infamous and neglected value form analysis of the third subsection of the first chapter of Capital, and with corresponding text in the Grundrisse, the critique in the first edition of Capital, which, although entirely at odds with the exoteric labor theory of value, can be fruitfully interpreted and reconstructed. Footnote. My debt to Backhaus will be obvious to readers of German. To date, only the first of Backhaus's articles from 1969, parenthesis, written in 1965. See the list of Backhaus's work in the bibliography has appeared in English translation. And since this rebranding of this book in 2010, it is now 2025, and still so much of Backhaus's work remains untranslated. The only person whose work from that tradition is really translated very much is Michael Heinrich. And his work is like, and it's not really his like more like critical contributions, I guess, to the work, but like introductions to reading Marx. For instance, is it Wissenschaft vom Wert? Or whatever, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but The Science of Value hasn't been published in English, which is a real bummer. Anyway, End footnote. In the work of reconstruction, and self-evidently of necessity in the work of extension, it cannot be a matter of the juxtaposition of Marx quotations or the recounting of argumentation, but of developing an autonomous argumentation which, whilst owing a great deal to Marx, ultimately has to be assessed on its own merits. Section 2. General Methodological Remarks. In this subsection, an outline of general methodological conceptions will be provided. The following remarks do not constitute an argumentation, but rather provide rules for a dialogue between systematic thinking and everyday consciousness. Since as methodological remarks, the contents of the presentation will be initially abstracted from, only the most general impression of the methodological way of proceeding can be given. In the following subsection, where the kernel thoughts constituting the guiding thread for the reconstruction of the capital analysis are set out, certain contents will be briefly discussed. In recent times, the effort to reconsider the Marxian theory as a system in which concepts are derived one from the other has not found a special favor, particularly not in English-speaking Marxism. Even in West Germany, the spiritual home of Ableitung Marxismus. What the hell does that mean? Exoteric Marxism, maybe? Let's see. German to English. Derivative Marxism. Which I don't know precisely what that means. But generally, derivative Marxism means, derivative Marxism, I'd imagine, is in reference to the state derivation debate, which kind of is about like trying to derive the necessary features of the capitalist state from the critique of political economy. That's how I might take a stab at trying to explain what was being done in that debate, but I'm not sure. Even in West Germany, the spiritual home of Arbeitslungs Marxismus, the approach enjoyed only an ephemeral flowering. Part of the debate centered on the conflict between a logical and illogical historical mode of presentation. The representatives of the, quote, logical approach were in the main accused of operating with dry, abstract concepts which have a restricted validity in analyzing the historically given capitalist societies. The abstract bloodless categories, according to this position, should take on some color by incorporating historical material arising in overabundance in every phase of capitalist development. The defenders of a logical position maintained, on the contrary, that little clarity between the status of the categorical development in Marx's Capital has been won, especially not by the proponents of a logical historical position. The relationship between dialectical transitions in the capital analysis and historical material were not treated in a comically dogmatic and cursory way by referring to Engels, in any case contradictory remarks on the subject, which has not received any satisfactory treatment at the hands of the logical historicists. And if you don't know what that means, the logical historicism refers to an interpretation of Capital in which Capital is kind of viewed as like a historical book, a chronologically proceeding book, in which the book increases in complexity and concreteness, which parallels the historical development of actually existing capitalism, right? So, and the main argument with that is one of the main parts of that is the notion of simple commodity production, in which when Marx opens up before talking about capital circulation, starts talking about circulation as such, the metamorphosis of commodities becoming money and money becoming commodities. He's referring to like a society, like a pre-capitalist, generalized commodity producing society. That's what is being discussed in the first chapters of Capital, and people have since come down very hard on that, especially people operating in the tradition of in this kind of like Hegel influenced dialectical reconstruction of the capitalist totality in the mind, right? People view the opening chapters of Capital as logical abstractions. Not as like talking about some like in like very abstract terms a historical progression. It's a logical progression, is how they would describe it. Anyway, here a more detailed discussion of this debate cannot be gone into. The doctrinaire defenders of a derivationist approach have been unable to give a clear and plausible account about how a, quote, logical theory can be constructed. This inability has served to reinforce the prejudices of, quote, common sense and, quote, Marxist. Here we clear away a few of the most obvious misconceptions. With the term, quote, logical, everyday conception usually associates a way of argumentation bound by strict rules, in which one step follows from the preceding one with necessity. Mathematics is taken as the paradigm of such an argumentation. For those allergic to mathematics, it can be said that systematic thinking does not work with any mathematical form of proof, although it does make strenuous demands on the reader. Not only are the contents of a systematic social theory entirely different from mathematics, the one deals with the qualitative forms of social relations and phenomena, the other with space and time, but also the form of presentation. As Hegel points out in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit and elsewhere, the mathematical form of proof, contrary to a popular misconception, possesses no inner necessity, but only the reassurance that the steps of the proof lead eventually to the desired result, namely to the theorem which is to be proven. As opposed to this, systematic thinking argues for each transition in the presentation not by the application of axioms and rules of deduction, but by making clear why the presentation cannot come to rest at the systematic level already reached. A further difference of systematic thinking from mathematical or other types of logical thinking is its relationship to the phenomenality of the social world. This phenomenality is not negated and replaced by axioms and formal rules of deduction. Rather, the initial and further development of the presentation depends on its taking account of the contents of everyday consciousness. The latter is not abstractly negated by systematic thinking, but enters into dialogue with it. Hegel formulates this as follows, quote, against that, therefore, which consciousness declares within itself to be the in itself or the true, we have the yardstick which it itself erects and against which it measures its knowledge. ... Consciousness gives its yardstick in itself, and the investigation will be thereby a comparison of itself with itself. End quote. Hegel. The yardstick is not dragged in from the outside as a normative ought, which is to blame reality for its shortcomings on the basis of an a priori moral code, but is an imminent, quote, comparison of itself with itself, end quote. That's actually a pretty good description, I think, of imminent critique, right? Capitalism's explaining the contradictions of, I guess, like, shit, how am I saying this? Is explaining what capitalism, I guess, represented by political economy, has to say about itself, and its actual functioning, right? And the idea isn't to encourage capitalism, if you're doing an immanent critique, to live up to its standards, but to show that it can't live up to its own standards. That beneath the freedom and equality of bourgeois society, there is substantial domination. At the beginning of the presentation stand the proponent of the dialectical theory and the opponent, who has a practical everyday knowledge of life in modern bourgeois society. The proponent takes certain elements of this everyday consciousness in forming the first concepts of analysis. In doing this, the proponent does not deny the opponent his/her everyday knowledge, but makes the claim, indispensable for the construction of the system, to be allowed to determine the systematic level at which the contents and arguments of everyday consciousness may be brought into play. So far, this sounds deceptively simple for anyone acquainted with the endless literature on, quote, Marx's method, unquote, Hegel's speculative logic, or with the methodology of empirical social research. With the construction of the first concepts of the presentation through an investigation of certain contents of everyday knowledge, the language of analysis is inaugurated. The opponent who has followed through the construction of these concepts must now continue the dialogue with the proponent by paying regard to the language of analysis, i.e. to the conceptual categories developed to that point. The objections formulated by everyday consciousness now have to take the appropriate form of conceptually articulated objections. Everyday consciousness feels itself a little hemmed in, but may nevertheless abide by the rules of the dialogue and see what comes out. Everyday consciousness is raised beyond its prosaic level. It becomes gebildet and is aufgehoben. Everyday consciousness is gradually taken up and dissolved in the systematic presentation without ever having been negated. The aim of systematic thinking is to achieve a knowledge of the inner connection, of the bourgeois form of social totality, which can be mediated to everyday consciousness by way of the presentation. The presentation comes to a close when the general phenomenality of this social totality has found a place within the presentation at which it has been conceptualized to the satisfaction of the opponent. Everyday consciousness thereby can agree that its general contents have been taken into account by systematic thinking, while simultaneously gaining insight into the inner coherence in the essential structure of bourgeois social relations, diffracted by the chaos of impressions and experiences of everyday life. Dialectical thinking is a coming to rest amidst the chaos, which continues to exist as an inchoate mass of confused fragments. Everyday consciousness maintains its validity in daily life, in practically dealing with the multifaceted world with which it is confronted. The first categories of the analysis initiate the investigation of the essence of capitalist society, an essence which the analysis claims to have found within the anatomy of capitalist society. These first fundamental concepts are the basis upon which the whole conceptual structure arises, and are thus crucial for the presentation. They formulate the inner thread that can be drawn through the whole analysis, and which allows the bourgeois form of society to be conceptualized precisely as a totality. Systematic thinking reveals bourgeois society to be a connected whole in a sense which can only be shown by the presentation itself. This is simultaneously a ground for thinking in a system. According to its claim, the real object, the bourgeois form of society, is indeed a connected whole, a system which can only be successfully comprehended when thinking likewise constructs conceptually the connection between the parts. Quote, the true is the whole. The whole, however, is only the essence, which completes itself through its development, end quote. Hegel. Formulated in another way, systematic thinking can be conceived as the investigation of the general form of society, which arises necessarily on the basis of the indirect Vergesellschaftung of labor through the commodity form. The generality of the theory as form analysis arises from the fact that the phenomenality of bourgeois society is not uniquely determined by the essential relations of production, but is nevertheless unique in its form, and that not as a, quote, ideal type, end quote, from which reality diverges to a greater or lesser extent. See further below on epochal validity. If on the one hand, systematic thinking does not abstractly negate the phenomenality of everyday life, on the other, it does not surrender the stringency of a conceptual development. It exerts itself to make the transitions from one level of the analysis to the next convincing and unarbitrary. The incorporation of new elements of everyday consciousness into the analysis does not happen capriciously, but is prepared by the preceding level of the analysis. Quote, scientific knowing, however, demands rather the surrender of oneself to the life of the object, or in other words, to have before oneself and express the inner necessity of the object. End quote. Hegel. The necessity of the movement of the presentation is bound to the concept of contradiction. Bound to the concept of contradiction, which gives systematic theory its dialectical character. The first concepts of the presentation articulate a doubledness, in reality consisting of two moments, particularity and universality, which are mutually dependent. Particularity and universality, which are mutually dependent and simultaneously sundered from one another. This sundering means that each moment contains within that moment the implicit claim to be the whole. The moments are thus, in this sense, mutually exclusive. The contradiction can only exist in reality in that one moment is subordinated to the other. The movement of the presentation is the movement of the contradiction between the two moments. In part, the analysis is the investigation of the domination of the one moment, universality, over the other. In part, the analysis is the investigation of the domination of the one moment, universality of the other moment, over the other moment. In other parts, the analysis is of the form of movement of particularity. The form of movement of particularity in the shadow of universality. In yet other parts, the analysis is of the forms in which the two moments strive for reconciliation and identity with one another. Identity, however, could only be achieved if the contradiction ceased to exist in reality, in which case it would no longer make sense to speak of two separated moments. The contradiction between universality and particularity is thus the inner motor of the presentation, which at the same time constitutes the inner band. The revelation of this contradiction in all this contradiction's ramifications is the critique of the bourgeois form of society. Footnote: the inspiration for these formulations I owe to Lucia Kleiber. See Kleiber's article, Schein und Fetisch, which I think Schein means appearance, and fetish, you know what that means. End footnote. In this way, the dialogue with everyday consciousness, expressible in Hegelian terms as a phenomenology, is also an immanent movement, driven by the necessity of the concept, in the attempts at the reconstruction of a critical social philosophy. The one aspect of the argumentation should not be played out at the expense of the other. The systematic presentation is neither a logical deduction of one concept from another, nor is it a mere stringing together of everyday phenomena in a convenient order which does not exceed the self-understanding of everyday consciousness. The systematic presentation brings social phenomena to their concept. The concept itself is first developed in a dialogue with the contents of everyday consciousness. In this sense, systematic thinking is a constructivist methodology. It builds its language of analysis up in a stepwise dialogical development. The bringing of a phenomenon to its concept is simultaneously the demonstration of its place within the total connection of social phenomenality. At the same time, this bringing of a phenomenon to its concept is strenuous and demands an attention to the formulation of the conceptual language of the analysis, as well as to the distinction between systematic levels. Libertarian and lazy elements in everyday consciousness experience a strong disinclination at this thought. Which, however, is not insuperable, if consciousness makes clear to itself that the effort will not be wasted. Quote,
Soup's done.
Awesome.
Pretty hot. It's got a cool little dose.
Awesome. Quote, to refrain from one's own interference with the immanent rhythm of the concepts, not to intervene. Did I say quote? Quote, to refrain from one's own interference with the immanent rhythm of the concepts, not to intervene with caprice and other acquired wisdom. This reservedness is itself an essential moment of attentiveness to the concept. End quote. Hegel. Although systematic thinking remains in dialogue with everyday consciousness, its claim to be able to determine the place in which the moments of everyday consciousness are brought in to the presentation can seem to everyday consciousness to do violence to it. The demands of the systematic presentation can lead to the separation of moments which for natural consciousness, quote, naturally belong together. As real imagined subject, the concept formed of it by bracketing certain aspects for everyday consciousness seems poor and unreal. The real object appears dismembered. This appearance of dismembering, this, quote, activity of separating, end quote, arises in the contrast between the natural connections, including causal relations, assumed by everyday consciousness in daily life, and the unfamiliar connections which systematic thinking exposes through its determinations by reflection. Reflection's Bestimmungen. To everyday consciousness, the inner connection constructed by separating its moments appears alien and fictitious. The former can only convince itself of the adequacy and justice of the systematic ordering and dissecting by following through the argumentation itself to see if in fact an inner connection is successfully constructed. The strangeness of the methodological dissection is to be compensated for by the insight into the essential relations. which strips away the natural evidence of accepted everyday phenomena and forms of consciousness. Everyday consciousness is shaken by its encounter with systematic thinking and may resist the attempt to reconstruct its apparent obviousness. It often does this by refusing to accept the rules of the systematic dialogue and counterposes its own idea of what social theory should look like. Marx's, quote, materialist method, quote, history, quote, concrete analysis, quote, discourse analysis, quote, semiotic delinquency, and quote, etc., etc. Through this stratagem, a dialogue never gets off the ground. Well and good. There are lots of fascinating things in the world, and one can't do everything. Systematic thinking can only make clear its demand that everyday consciousness take leave of the well-known and its preconditions and give itself over to the unfolding of the systematic argument. Quote, conversely, the individual has the right to demand that science reaches to him/her, the latter to this standpoint, end quote. The final question to which we turn in this subsection is that concerning the epochal validity of the analysis. Against the astounding rush of historical change and specificity, for naive consciousness it seems daring to claim as theoretical object an epochally valid form of society. Systematic thinking enters into dialogue and dispute with everyday consciousness as it exists in contemporary modern society. It claims to conceptualize the specific form of bourgeois society by relating to certain moments of everyday consciousness in a characteristic way. Everyday consciousness itself knows only its present form and what it has heard of history, and cannot itself select these elements which possess an epochally universal validity. This section is a task left for systematic thinking. This selection is a task left for systematic thinking. It must be able to construct its categories in such a way that not only the definite limited phase or only a particular society is conceptualized. The systematic presentation is exposed to a test of its validity in every historical phase in every particular society through the reader's attempt to make sense of the argument. Although bourgeois society is characterized by continuous, rapid, and sometimes momentous change, systematic thinking claims to have grasped the general forms within which this change takes place. The forms themselves are universal. Not only the particular situation, structure of institutions, state of technology, concentration of capital, etc., etc., as it actually exists at a specific point of time, is of relevance for systematic thinking, but above all the forms of consciousness, which may represent a demand on reality rather than encapsulating the actually existing state of affairs. Forms of consciousness are not tied to the here and now of the historically particular situation, but can refer to both past and future. The forms of consciousness refer not only to how in a particular society the social and private life is actually organized, but also to how consciousness thinks reality could or should be. This consciousness of should and could exist in the present and forms part of the material with which systematic thinking disputes. Systematic thinking aims at grasping the general social form of the social sphere, economy, state, and private life, as well as their relation to one another. Their particular shape and relation to one another can alter historically without invalidating the systematic analysis. Epochal validity refers immediately to a philosophical theme, whereas sociology, economic, and other social sciences concern themselves with particular constellations of phenomena observed with indefinite coordinates of time and space. philosophy occupies itself with the universal character of our social situation. The historical birth of bourgeois society was simultaneously the period in which classical bourgeois social philosophy attempted to give an account of bourgeois society per se. In doing this, it concerned itself with questions of morality, ethics, and the general character of capitalist economy. The dissolution of philosophy in the various social sciences has meant the sight has been lost of central universal socio-political themes. Certain key phenomena nevertheless recur again and again in various disguises in philosophy and the social sciences, even if they are today quickly gone over in favor of more particular context-bound questions or held at arm's length with a positivist skepticism. One question which has been suppressed more and more by philosophy and social science, to a point where most academics no longer see any point whatsoever in posing it, is, what is capital? Economics talks continually about capital and does very well even in its lack of being able to ground one of its basic concepts. A similar remark holds for the question, what is bourgeois freedom? Sociology fashions the question into a problem which can be treated by empirical methods and gives it most definitions of what is meant by the term. Philosophy handles the question in ethics and finds itself incapable of providing a form-determinate concept. This incapacity is intimately bound to the failure of philosophy to adequately conceptualize private property. Classical bourgeois philosophy operated in a problematic inseparable from that of political economy. Since the two have parted company, neither is able to provide a concept of private property. They mutually hinder one another. A further external indication that a critical social theory concerns itself with central, apocally valid categories is the necessity of a dispute with alternative theories and partial theories during the course of the presentation. In this dispute, the alternative theories are treated as aspects of everyday consciousness, or more precisely as attempts to work up everyday consciousness or aspects thereof into an understanding of itself. In the center of this dispute stands the consideration of a correct conceptualization of the quote, free market, unquote, capitalist economy, the bourgeois-democratic state, the private life of the bourgeois individual, and the relations between them. In this way, systematic thinking carries on a dialogue not only with the naive conceptions which spring literally out of everyday life, but also and especially with opposed, more or less elaborated theoretical positions. The latter dialogue represents also the greater exertion of systematic thinking, because elaborated theories make pretensions to scientific legitimacy and therefore enjoy a following which is prepared to argue against or dismiss the arguments of systematic thinking. Quote, it is, however, far more difficult to bring fixed thoughts into motion than sensuous consciousness, end quote. Hegel. If one proceeds from the concept of an ideal speech situation, one could take the attitude, let the fisticuffs begin, and let the better position win. The present work is called an outline, partly because it does not try to fight out every skirmish, rather it sounds a battle cry. An explication of the object of systematic thinking, the relation of the presentation at hand to the Marxian theory, and a description of the whole system into which the present work fits will be provided in the following subsections. Section 3. Value form analytic reconstructions of the capital analysis. The theoretical object of the capital analysis, as understood in our efforts at reconstruction, is the capitalist form of social material reproduction. In theoretically investigating this object, the analysis is simultaneously a critique of bourgeois economic categories, in that it lays bare the contradictoriness of this form of material reproduction. We will return to the theme of, quote, contradictoriness, and quote below. The capital analysis investigates the forms and process of capitalist economic objectivity. This analysis of a form-determinate objectivity is to be complemented by an investigation of the forms and action of economic subjectivity in the competition analysis. Form analysis is to be distinguished from the predominant understanding of historical materialism as a theory of historical development. Adorno polemicized against this conception of social history, which can be found also in the writings of the founders of scientific socialism. Quote, "It was a matter of the deification of history, also with the atheist Hegelians, Marx and Engels. The primacy of the economy is supposed to ground, with historical rigor, the happy ending is imminent to it. The economic process is supposed to produce the political relations of domination and revolutionize them to the point of a compulsive liberation from the compulsion of the economy," end quote. Adorno. Having modern Marxism and other critical theories cannot be regarded as having freed themselves. Modern Marxism and other critical theories cannot be regarded as having freed themselves from some variant or other of a mechanics of history. Such theory has no way of intervening in history as an explicit critique of consciousness, which could initiate a movement leading away from the present form of society. Without this explicit critique, consciousness will never see the sense of putting the forms into question. Developmental theory can be understood in two senses. Firstly, as a theory of the progression of class societies from epoch to epoch, and secondly, as a theory of capitalist development within the bourgeois epoch. Both these variants of histomat, or historical materialism, are well represented within Marxism. The first owes its classical formulation to Engels' Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. It served as basic text for a series of vulgarizations within social democracy, and which was elaborated on by Stalin in On Dialectical and Historical Materialism. The second variant is represented by massive amounts of contemporary Marxist literature, and finds its classical formulation, perhaps, with Hilferding's Finance Capital and Sweezy's Theory of Capitalist Development. A competing developmental theory, both trans-epochal and within the bourgeois epoch, is Habermas's and his school's proposed reconstruction of historical materialism. Footnote: interestingly enough, in an interview shortly before the appearance of his two-volume work, Theorie des Kommunikativen Handelns, which I think is Theory of Communicative Action, in December 1981, Habermas refers expressly to Sweezy's book as having influenced him at the end of the 50s. End footnote. Sorry, 1 second. End footnote. Form analysis, in marking itself off from developmental theory, takes as its starting point the striking autonomy of the argumentation in Capital, Marx's Capital, when understood as a systematic argumentation aiming at the conceptualization of epochal chain categories. The debate between systematic theory and developmental theory finds a firm ground for contestation in the interpretation of the Marxian Capital analysis. There, the decisive point is clarification of the distinction between a logical dialectical and logical historical mode of presentation. The theorist who has occupied himself most intensively with this question is Hans-Georg Backhaus. Backhaus has shed light upon the methodological problems of Marx's texts in relation to the perplexing phenomenon of the various versions, published by Marx himself, of the Marxian theory. According to Backhaus, of the four versions of the Marxian form analysis of commodities and money, the first, which appeared in Critique of 1859, presents the value theory most consistently as a dialectical, quote, logical argumentation. The logical analysis is clearly separated from the historical, which later comprises only the last 2 pages of the analysis of commodities and money in the first chapter of the Critique. Quote, In this pseudo-historical appendix to the first version of the Marxian value theory, however, one must see the germ of its later, quote, historicization, and quote, vulgarization by Marx himself, above all, however, by the late Engels and the Marxist interpreters, end quote. Backhaus, 1981. This statement by Backhaus is the result of a painstaking study of Marxian and Engelsian texts, as well as of letters written by both. Backhaus shows that even Engels did not consistently represent a logical historical interpretation, but rather oscillated from a historical logical position in the 1859 review of the Critique to a logical position in the Conspect and Anteduring to a final logical historical position in the foreword and appendix to the third volume of Capital of 1894 to 95. The Engelsian theory of simple commodity production developed in this appendix can be viewed as a consistent conclusion to the tendency towards historicization already present in the value theory as presented by Marx in the second edition of Capital. Backhaus also shows that Marx's silence on Engels' 1859 review, which confuses the outlines a logical historical mode of presentation, can plausibly be interpreted as an unsureness and unclarity of Marx's part as to the distinguishing characteristics of his, quote, materialist manner of presentation, as opposed to a Hegelian, quote, idealist presentation. Quote, it is of course not to be overlooked that he, bracket Engels and bracket, feels similar scruples to Marx with regard to, quote, dialectically one and, quote, results. The central problem for their conceptual construction, how on the basis of a non-idealist, quote, scientific theory, quote, dialectically one, results can be grounded, occupies both again and again, ... The Engelsian statement on method in the 1859 review has scarcely anything in common with Marx's actual procedure. If Marx did not, quote, tear up, end quote, or, quote, rectify even this passage of the review, then one can only see in this a further indication for the fact that he was not able to gain any proper clarity about the distinctiveness of his procedure, end quote. Backhaus. It can easily be shown that the reference to historical data as an additional means of proof for dialectical argumentation, at least in relation to the value theory, reveals itself to be an empty mythological construction. Marx's unclarity about his own methodological mode of procedure and the resultant multitude of versions of the value theory must be seen as the primary source of vulgarization and neglect of the niceties of the value theory in the hands of Marx's interpreters. After the appearance in the first version of the value theory, Marx admits in a letter to Kugelmann that there must be, quote, something defective in the first presentation, end quote. Marx to Kugelmann, October 13, 1866. This admission is connected with the disappointing reception of the critique, even in the circle of political comrades. Wilhelm Leibniz commented that he had never before, quote, been so disappointed by a book, end quote. Marx to Engels, July 22nd, 1859. Such evidence leads Backhaus to the conclusion that, quote, very quickly after the appearance of the critique, Marx must have had the experience of not having been properly understood, end quote. Backhaus. Marx's disappointment at the reception of his work did not stop with the appearance of the first edition of Capital Volume 1 in 1867. We pursue this matter of how Marx's theory was immediately received in order to highlight the difficulties with which Marx was confronted in having his theory taken seriously at all. In particular, the story following is instructive in showing how the stubbornness of editors and readers, who basically do not want to upset their prejudices, tempts Marx to make a greater effort to popularize, and thereby cut off access to the radical kernel of his theory. The editors of the Marx-Engels Werke write, quote, the 9 reviews by Engels of Marx's Capital hitherto discovered were part of a plan worked out by Marx and Engels to counteract a bourgeois, quote, conspiracy of silence, end quote. bracket, directed against the critique, a contribution to the critique of political economy, 1859, Michael Eldred, in parentheses. The editors do not mention that not only German national economy, but by and large also the German workers' movement had ignored the critique. As a side note, I think, and this is an overlooked, if this is true, this is an overlooked feature, but evidently the initial volume of Marx's Capital was extremely expensive. Like buying a copy of Capital for a working class person would have been very, 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 very expensive. Back to the text. To avoid a recurrence of this fate, Marx and Engels organized the publication of reviews in Germany and elsewhere, in hopes of publishing a longer review in 2 parts in a British magazine. The Fortnightly Review, quote, founded in May 1865 by a group of bourgeois radicals, end quote, parenthesis, Marx, Engels, Werke editors, and Engels, 1981, in bracket. According to the editors, quote, for this review, Marx and Engels repeatedly exchanged opinions as to content and form, as can be seen from their correspondence. Marx gave advice and wrote also variants for individual passages, which Engels completely took up in the text. The article was to appear under the name of Samuel Moore, a friend of Engels, end quote. If one goes through the correspondence between Marx and Engels between January and July 1868, when Engels had finished writing the review, some curious points come to light. Marx had contact with a certain Professor Beazley of the University of London, who was closely associated with the First International. Quote, Professor Beazley, who is one of the triumvirate which secretly runs this rag, has declared he is, quote, morally certain, end quote, parenthesis, it depends on him, exclamation point, in parenthesis, a criticism would be accepted, end quote. Marx to Engels, January 8th, 1868. In his letter to Marx of the 16th and 23rd of January 1868, Engels asks Marx's advice concerning the review. The following sentences deserve attention, quote, in the first article I'll probably be able to touch on the money system, although important for England, only fleetingly. Otherwise it will take up the whole article. If we could bring a second, then it could still come in. What do you think? End quote. Engels to Marx, 23rd of January, 1868. To answer this question, one finds only the sentence, quote, as soon as your article for the Fortnightly is at hand, the FAR can turn it into French for the Courrier Français, end quote. Marx to Engels, 1st of February, 1868. Engels could not have found this answer very satisfying. He writes, quote, although the matter concerning money is important and interesting also for England, parenthesis, question mark, exclamation point, and parenthesis, I think it is appropriate this time to let it fade into the background. It would detract from the main topic and demand a long discussion so that the English reader would even understand that it is a matter of simple money as such, which he is used to imagining only in its intertwining with credit money, etc. What do you think? Unquote. Engels to March, 2nd of February, 1868. In Engels' estimation, the, quote, matter concerning money, end quote, is a secondary matter which, quote, would detract from the main topic, end quote, namely the surplus value namely the surplus value theory as theory of class exploitation. The review Engels finally writes in June 1886, indeed, deals almost exclusively with the surplus value theory and makes only a passing reference to the money theory. Quote, the first chapter of the first edition, end bracket, contains a new and very simple value and money theory that is, scientifically speaking, extremely interesting, which, however, we will leave out of consideration, since for that which we hold to be the essence of Mr. Marx's views on capital, it is on the whole secondary. Parenthesis, exclamation point, and parenthesis, end quote. Engels. In this cursory way, Engels pushes Marx's, quote, value of money theory, end quote, to one side. Quite astounding is the description of the, quote, value and money theory, end quote, as, quote, very simple, end quote. This description contradicts not only Marx's self-estimation, but even Engels' estimation in a review he wrote on November 12, 1867, for the Rheinische Zeitung, which was never published. In this review, Engels writes, quote, we add that, apart from the somewhat strongly dialectical matters in the first 40 pages, the book, despite all scientific rigor, is nonetheless very easy to grasp, end quote. Engels. It seems that Engels took an easy way out in the review for the fortnightly. Perhaps not wanting to scare the English reader with a mention of dialectics, he misrepresents the value and money theory as, quote, very simple, end quote. In any case, the Engels regarded the exploitation theory as the central point of the first volume is clear. In reply to the above quoted letter, Marx writes to Engels, quote, I am completely of your opinion that at first you should not go more closely into the money theory, but only hint that the matter is treated in a new way, end quote. Marx, February 4th, 1868. Marx was thus in agreement with Engels that the money theory was secondary for the purpose of introducing his work to the public, although it only puts the word, quote, new, and not the words, quote, very simple, in Engels' mouth. Marx himself, therefore, concurs with the introduction of a hiatus between the value theory and the theory of surplus value, here including the theory of absolute and relative surplus value production. The latter is obviously viewed by Marx as containing the critical content amenable to political agitation. The value theory is relegated to a scientific status, important for superseding other economic theories, but secondary from the point of view of radical politics. The history of Marxism has entrenched this caesura between the first and second parts of Volume 1. A critical content of the value of money theory has never made itself felt in the political sphere. Marx himself was not in a position to clarify the critical import of the connection between the categories of the value theory and those of the surplus value theory. The dialectical figures of the value form analysis were not regarded by Marx as being essential for making the critique of capitalist relations implied by the surplus value theory lucid. If this had been so, then it would have been folly to suppress the value theory in even a short article, which was to have had political reverberations. Marx's increasing vulgarization of the dialectical aspects of the value theory and the lack of a dialectical development of the category of capital out of that of money have sealed off the critical content of the Marxian theory for over 100 years. Because Engels is taken up with the business in the Manchester factory, he cannot find the time to come to writing down the, quote, Beasley article. See the letter Engels to Marx, April 10th, 1868. He has considerable trouble with settling on an appropriate beginning to the article, and again asks Marx's advice in letters of 10th and 22nd of May. Marx replies on the 23rd of May with a draft of a beginning, which Engels actually reworks and incorporates into the review. Concerning the value theory, Marx reiterates his view that it should be skipped, but distances himself slightly in his choice of words. Quote, in my view, since you want to begin with chapter 2, bracket, part 2 in the second edition, in bracket, you must not forget how to draw the reader's attention somewhere to the fact that she will find the value and money shit presented in a new way, in Chapter 1. The following could be used as introduction, of course in a form suitable to yourself, and could. Marx to Engels, May 23rd, 1868. Again, here there is only a reference to the newness of the value and money theory, and not to its extreme simplicity. Marx is concerned only to point out to the reader the newness of his value theory, and not that it is crucial for his analysis of capitalist production. He apparently has the attitude that the value theory is the logical prerequisite of his theory of capitalist production, but is not indispensable for understanding what the latter theory means, and especially that the critique is of capitalist production. The Marxist discussion in recent years has adopted this apparent Marxian attitude. See also Marx's advice to Mrs. Kugelmann. In every way, by setting up the problem of whether the Marxian value theory is necessary for the Marxian theory of class exploitation. The neo-Ricardians have reveled in demonstrating that value magnitudes are redundant, in demonstrating that the capitalists expropriate surplus product. Footnote, see Ian Steedman, 1977. One second. Come on. Okay. End footnote. Quote, from the 29th of May until about 15th of June, Marx and his daughter Eleanor stayed in Manchester with Engels, end quote. Marx Engels Werke, 17, 734 edition, note 127. Marx presumably gave Engels more tips for the review during his stay, parenthesis, passages to quote, etc., in parenthesis. In any case, Engels writes to Marx on the 22nd of June with the news that, quote, the article is coming along famously and will be positively read this week, end quote. Engels. On the 28th of June, quote, the article is ready, end quote. The piece was sent to Professor Beazley, who, quote, sent it to Henry, parenthesis, Marx is mistaken, he's called John M.E., he's called John, who, quote, sent it to Henry, parenthesis, Marx is mistaken, Beazley is called John, in parenthesis. Morley, oh, fuck, god damn it, it's fucking confusing. The piece was sent to Professor Beazley, who, quote, sent it to Henry, parenthesis, Marx is mistaken, he's called John, in parenthesis, Morley, parenthesis, chief editor of the Fortnightly Review, in parenthesis. Marx to Engels, 23rd of July, 1868. And then a couple of weeks later, quote, enclosed letter from J. Morley, the chief editor of the Fortnightly. Beazley did his best, but Mr. M found the thing unreadable. Never mind, end quote. Marx to Engels, 10th of August, 1868. Engels is understandably upset in his next letter about the, quote, petty-minded, lousy clique system, end quote, etc. Engels to Marx, August 12, 1868. The affair with the Fortnightly closes with a meeting between Marx and Professor Beazley. Quote, I had a meeting with Beazley. The sub-editor of Morley explained, the development is irreversible. Indeed, the article is too, quote, dry for a magazine. Beazley proposes I popularize the thing without sacrificing the scientific points. This is rather difficult. However, I will try to, end quote. Marx to Engels, 15th of October, 1868. In the course of the months, Beasley's attitude changes from, quote, moral certainty, end quote, that a review could be published, to the view that Marx should try to popularize and not be so dry. Beasley offers an alternative, namely that the popularized article should appear in the Westminster Review. It appears that here too nothing came of the offhand offer. It is clear from this and other stories that Marx had considerable trouble in finding readers. Samuel Moore was an exception. Quote, the most conscientious reader of your book here is Sam Moore. He has thoroughly worked through over 600 pages and swats on unflaggingly. End quote. Engels to Marx, March 19th, 1868. And editors who would take his work seriously. Wilhelm Liebknecht, for example, is frightfully enthusiastic to propagate Marx's theory, although Marx was convinced that he had not, quote, read 15 pages of the book, end quote. Marx to Engels, 25th of February, 1858. The detailed investigation by Bachhaus served as grounds for initiating a reconstruction of at least the value theory. And since the value theory is the conceptual foundation of the entire conceptual structure of Marx's Capital, reconstruction cannot stop short with a new version of the value theory. The methodological remarks provided in 2 have explicitly set out a particular mode of argumentation which unambiguously marks itself off from any logical historical methodology. This methodology has been formulated in a consideration not only of Marx but also of Hegel and of modern German constructivism. By taking an explicit methodological position, the character of dialectics is brought into the open, an explicit dialectics which emphasizes the category of contradiction in the context of the contents of the analysis, is able to demonstrate that what is implied by critique. This methodology has been applied to our reconstructed capital analysis. The starting point is a new value theory, which results from separating a form-analytic strand of argumentation from a classical labor theory of value of the Ricardian type. Arguments for his separation of the grain from the chaff cannot be gone into here. The reconstruction lays particular emphasis on the fact that the value theory is the foundation of a particular theory of money, namely as form of value. This value theory of money is simultaneously a critique of all pre-monetary value theories. Commodities and money are to be understood as the form of social synthesis, Vergesellschaftung of bourgeois labor. This specific concept of the Vergesellschaftung of labor enables then an analysis of the capitalist production, circulation, and reproduction processes during which further value forms such as wages, surplus value, capital, rent, interest, profit, fixed and circulating capital arise. The reader will note from the overall structure given in section 1 above, that the order of presentation of the various themes also diverges from Marx's. Here I do not give a more detailed explication of salient features of our reconstructed capital analysis. I conclude this subsection with an anticipation of a result 1 by value form analytic considerations, which distinguishes it from common interpretations of Marx's theory. The inspiration for this divergence can be found in Marx himself, above all in certain passages in the Grundrisse, and also in aspects of Adorno's interpretation of Marx. In Negative Dialectics, Adorno stresses a characteristic of capitalist relations as, quote, a universal which realizes itself over the heads of the subjects, end quote. Adorno, quote, because the constitutive forms of social synthesis, maintain their unconditional supremacy over human beings, as if they were divine destiny, end quote. Adorno. In support of this view, Adorno quotes the Grundrisse, quote, the individuals are subsumed under social production, which exists outside them as a stroke of fate. But social production is not subsumed under the individuals, which employ them as its communal asset. End quote. Marx. This passage occurs in a discussion of money and exchange value, and cannot therefore be interpreted as applying only to the laborers who were subsumed under capital, but to all the individuals caught up in capitalist economy. This generalization of those who are the, quote, prisoners of capitalist relations is taken up by Adorno in Adorno's later writings, where he refers to the extension of the power of reified social relations over the capitalists themselves. Quote, domination over humans is still exercised through the economic process. Its objects are long since not only the masses, but also those with power of disposal and their appendage, end quote. Adorno. This shift of emphasis in the critical import of social theory signals the displacement of the theory of surplus value as a theory of class exploitation from its central place in the traditional self-understanding of Marxism. The laborers are indeed subsumed under capitalist relations in a characteristic way, which involves the generation of surplus value. The surplus value theory, however, is reformulated as the theory of a contradiction on the basis of a new on the basis of a form-analytic value theory. For some reason I said the word new there. The word new is not there. The point of the surplus value theory is not the scientific proof of class exploitation. The concern with an exploitation theory in this sense belongs to the tradition of Marxism, understood as a science of history of the various class societies, through to bourgeois society. The next step in the march of history should abolish this class exploitation once and for all. Some Marxists refer to the surplus value theory as a theory of the form in which surplus product is appropriated under capitalism. This is a bare improvement on a vulgar histomat. Surplus value is indeed the value form of the surplus product appropriated by capital. Some Marxists interpret this as a theory of how class exploitation under capitalism is disguised under the value form. This leads back to an understanding of scientific socialism as uncovering, the hidden, exploitation in capitalism, disguised by the deluding formal equality of labor and capitalists as free persons. The formal equality of free persons comes somewhat closer to the crux of a critique of capitalism, but not in connection with the fact that surplus product is appropriated. Attention should instead be focused on the relation between these free persons, namely the wage-labor relation. By virtue of the wage form of value, the laborer stands under the domination of the capitalist in the production process. The latter employs the former as an object as far as possible, like a piece of machinery in the production of commodities. This negation of the laborer's subjectivity is the kernel of the critique of capital. This negation of the laborer's subjectivity is the kernel of the critique of capital. The value categories allow the subjugated subjectivity of the laborers to be expressed. The laborers are subjected to the wage form, an aspect of the value totality, and to the capitalist command in the production process, which he can exercise only as a personification of the value totality. The value categories articulate that wages and alien power of capital are nothing but the alienated form of their own labor. The reified form of their own labor subsumes them in the production process. The capitalist is the agent of this subjugation, and simultaneously is himself subsumed under the value form, as buyer and seller of commodities. In providing the categories for the analysis of the negation of subjectivity through the universal domination of abstract social labor over living labor, the value form analysis lays the ground for a negation of the negation. If subjectivity were to become aware of the extent of its negation through the abstract universality, this knowledge could lead to a consistent collective act to overcome this subjugation once and for all. The theme, negation of subjectivity, cannot be restricted to a critique of economy. The bourgeois private sphere presents itself as the realm where subjectivity can flower. Critical thinking can show just how illusory this flowering of subjectivity is in a society where social labor exists as reified totality. The fragmentary character of Marxist theory shows itself as having decidedly political consequences. The critique cannot be made clear without an analysis which grasps the whole. Section 4. The analysis of competitive freedom. The object of the competition analysis is the forms of consciousness and action of the individuals on the surface of capitalist economy. The characterization of this object as surface is already a reference to the fact that there is not a matter of an autonomous, that here it is not a matter of an autonomous object which is immediately accessible to analysis. The capital analysis constitutes the necessary systematic prelude to the analysis of competitive freedom. The essential relations of production, the bourgeois economic categories which are foreign to everyday consciousness, now assume forms of appearance which mask the pre-given economic objectivity, and which, as forms of action and consciousness, are near to the familiar conceptions of everyday consciousness. The imaginary character of these surface relations as independent social forms is to be demonstrated through the construction of an inner connection with the categories expressing the abstract universality of the capitalist mode of production. In particular, the way in which the total movement of valorization proceeds through the opposed strivings of the subjects of competition is to be explained. The competition and capital analyses are complementary not only from the side of the former, but also from the side of the capital analysis. The latter operates with a reduced concept of subjectivity. The economic actors appear there merely as the representatives of economic categories, who fulfill roles which are adequate to and identical with aspects of the total valorization process of capital. If terms of intentionality, aims, means, etc., i.e. a terminology of subjectivity, are employed in the capital analysis, it must be understood that this is the surrogate subjectivity of executors of an economic process which asserts itself in conceptual categories foreign to the conceptions of the subjects of everyday economic life. For this reason, we refer to the actors in the capital analysis as character masks. On the level of the competition analysis, by contrast, forms of subjectivity are thematized which correspond to everyday notions. Here it is a matter of the pursuit of individual aims with appropriate means. The means, property, are well known to everyday consciousness, as is the struggle which results from the implementation of these means. The concepts formed of these well-known phenomena, however, are alien to everyday consciousness. The concepts of the competition analysis reveal the underlying connection existing between the competitive struggle and the process of the value totality. The freedom of private property turns out to be based on an inversion, carum, of competition, subject, and value form, object. The subjects of competition who appear in the competition analysis are not to be identified with subjects per se. The concept of subjectivity on the level of competition remains restricted to the pursuit of economic interests. In this sense, the subjects of competition remain economic character masks. For the sake of terminological clarity, however, the term, quote, character mask is employed only for the level of the capital analysis. A fuller concept of subjectivity, where, for example, human needs and emotions come under conceptual scrutiny, will first be developed in the analysis of the private sphere. Roughly speaking, there are 4 tiers in the articulation of bourgeois subjectivity: character mask, capital analysis, subjective competition, private subject, the participation of the subject in the life of the concrete universal as citizen can be designated as a 4th broad level of subjectivity, treated in section 100, parenthesis, parts 9 and 10 of the whole system are left to one side, end parenthesis. The conceptual transition from the capital to the competition analysis is made via the level of revenue form analysis, which is presented in an appropriately modified form in Part 1. This is taken as transitionary level in the present work because the various value form categories and character masks are there summarized. On this level, too, a certain mystification of the process of value creation has been articulated, which smooths the way to the increasingly imaginary in relation to the essential form objectivity character of the social relations. It would be a peculiar misconception of the character of systematic thinking to turn this use of categories, which to a certain extent mystify the essence, into an objection against a systematic mode of presentation which takes forms of appearance of value seriously. In employing revenue source relations as transitionary categories, the systematic thread to deeper lying relations is not lost. On the contrary, thereby the inner thread is first demonstrated to consciousness. The insistence is made that the essence does not appear immediately, in which case a dialectical theory would be entirely superfluous, but mediated through forms of appearance. This mediation is performed through successive levels of the analysis. In the main text, we pass over Part 4 of the system with only a brief mention. This has been done for pragmatic reasons of space, to allow the reader eager to gain a vista of the planes lying behind the capital analysis the quickest possible access to this new territory. The risk with this propedeutic strategy is that the reader completely misses the point of the analysis. What does propedeutic mean? Propedeutic refers to serving as a preliminary instruction or as an introduction to further study, an introduction to a subject or area of study. Back to the text. The risk with this propedeutic strategy is that the reader completely misses the point of the analysis. I make, therefore, the following caveat. The reader wishing to fully understand or criticize the present work has no alternative in the long run but to work his or her way through the appendix. Since philosophy is a circle, it matters little where consciousness enters it, but it must be prepared to follow this circle back to its starting point if it is to completely unearth its own presuppositions. Although in his scientific plan Marx envisaged a treatment of competition separate from the analysis of capital in general, in the published first volume of Capital, remarks on competition are made which can only be regarded as systematic anticipations. In the chapter on the working day, for example, the struggle between the capitalists and the wage laborers over the length of the working day, a theme which properly belongs to the competition analysis, is discussed. In this context, Marx makes the following statement, quote, "The free competition enforces the immanent laws of capitalist production vis-a-vis the individual capitalist as external compulsion," end quote. Similar statements can be found also in the treatment of relative surplus value production in connection with the introduction of new methods of production. Such assertions, in spite of their ring of common sense in the ear of everyday consciousness, are necessarily programmatic. A concept of competitive subjectivity must first be developed before one can grasp what the compulsions of competition are. Marx nowhere clearly poses nor solves this conceptual problem. If one can claim that dialectical elements are increasingly eliminated in progressive versions of the value theory, then a much more drastic diagnosis holds for later portions of Marx's theory. The care with which Marx worked out a concept of money stands in rude contrast to the conceptually slovenly way in which certain contents of everyday consciousness are drawn into later levels of the analysis as self-explanatory obviousness. The analysis does not in the least get behind these obviousnesses to allow consciousness to gain a critical distance from them. Only the course of the analysis, the systematic relation of the competition analysis to the capital analysis, is able to elaborate Marx's remarks on the subject of competition in capital as statements about the competitive action of a form-determinate subjectivity. In the same section of the Grundrisse where formulations of the overhang of social objectivity are to be found, as quoted above in section 3, passages can be read which indicate the necessity of complementing the capital analysis with an analysis of competitive freedom in order to clarify how the subjects of competition deal with the overhang of objectivity with which they are confronted. We quote some Grundrisse passages which hint at the task to be fulfilled by systematic thinking. Quote, ... Rather, a universal negation results from this bellum omnium contra omnes, war of all against all. The point lies rather in the private interest itself, in the fact that the private interest itself is already a socially determinate interest and can only be achieved within conditions posited by society. That is, it is bound to the reproduction of these conditions and means. It is the interest of the private individual, but its content as well as form and means of realization is given by social conditions independent of all. The social character of the activity, as well as the social form of the product, and the portion which the individual has of production, appears here as something alien and thing-like, opposed to the individuals, not as the behavior of their mutual opposition, but as their subjugation under relations which exist independently of them, and which arise out of the clash of indifferent individuals with one another. The universal exchange of activities and products, which has become a condition of life for each single individual, their mutual connection appears to them itself alien, independent as a thing. Although the whole of this movement appears as social process, and although the single moments of this movement proceed from the conscious will and particular purposes of the individuals, the totality of the process appears nevertheless as an objective connection which arises as a natural growth, indeed proceeds from the effect on one another of the conscious individuals, but lies neither in their consciousness, nor is it as a whole subsumed under them. End quote. Grundrisse. Marx's discussion of these topics in the chapter on money indicates that he regards the kernel of this reification of social relations as lying in the commodity form. The adequate articulation of the confrontation of individuals with an alien social objectivity, however, requires the mediation of many categories that allow such categories as, quote, private interest, quote, means of realization of private interest, quote, mutual opposition of individuals, quote, universal exchange of activities and products, end quote, to be brought to an adequate conceptualization. The conceptual language on the level of the analysis of commodities and money, which only initiates the analysis of capitalist form objectivity, is too poor for the formulation of the richer, more concrete categories of the surface of economic life. Why is the competition analysis characterized as a critique of competitive freedom? With this characterization, it should not be overlooked that freedom is only one side of the coin. The other is the economic compulsion of the pre-given value form objectivity. The analysis of competitive freedom is simultaneously its critique, in that it demonstrates the conditional character of the freedom of competition subjects. It consists precisely in the freedom to compete. The freedom is realized in the pursuit of the economic interests to earn income with appropriate means, namely with various types of property. This freedom is not to be criticized as illusory, but is merely the obverse side of an indifferent compulsion of social objectivity. Competitive freedom does not exhaust the bourgeois forms of freedom. Consideration of other forms is reserved to later systematic levels. In terms of bourgeois society's consciousness of itself, freedom constitutes its principal category. Freedom is also a central concern of classical bourgeois philosophy. In particular, the concept of freedom is the fundamental category of Hegel's social theory of modern society in the philosophy of right. The present work provides the basis for an imminent critique of Hegel, which is outlined in several of the additions to the systematic paragraphs. This does not exclude that some of Hegel's arguments express with social validity the logic of the present form of life. Some Hegelian arguments will thus be found in the main text, mainly in connection with the analysis of the state. The critique of Hegel, who has written one of the most systematically elaborated theories of the bourgeois totality, is not a matter of blank negation of his system, say on methodologico-epistemological grounds, but rather one of raising it to a new, higher level, on which the contradictoriness of the totality is thrown into sharper relief. The Marxist tradition has come to regard Hegel as already superseded, as encapsulated in the all-purpose litmus of the dichotomy materialism/idealism. Marx is presupposed to have settled accounts with idealism earlier in his philosophical career, thereby discovering together with Engels the quote dialectical materialist method, which disposes of Hegelian idealism and in which historical material serves as reassuring underpinning. As we have discussed in 3 above, a closer scrutiny of Marx's text reveals an unsureness of Marx's part in methodological questions. If one begins to doubt whether Marx had developed a dialectical materialist method which stands Hegel's idealism on its feet, then the convenient dichotomy materialism/idealism in the bag of tricks for disposing of theories loses its credibility. A sensible borderline between Marx and Hegel cannot be drawn methodologically, with a broad reference to materialism and idealism. The two thinkers are to be distinguished from one another on the level of content of their theories and in their respective theoretical starting points. Marx is namely the theorist who explores the, quote, anatomy of bourgeois society, end quote, from the starting point of the analysis of commodities and money. The relevance of today providing a critique of competitive freedom is poignantly highlighted when one casts a glance at the apologists of this freedom, such as Friedrich von Hayek and Max Weber. Hayek is a modern defender of the benevolent workings of Adam Smith's, quote, invisible hand, which purportedly works a miracle that could not be consciously construed. Form analysis can elucidate the more crippling side swipes of this capricious hand, which is certainly no helping hand for those with no visible means of support, among others. The influence of Weber in modern social theory is not to be underestimated. Weber systematizes some of the principal prejudices regarding the advisability of bourgeois freedom and the impossibility of achieving anything better historically. The centrality of the concern with the freedom of the individual in economic life, from Hobbes to the present day, is an index for the fact that we are here dealing with an epochal category. A dialectical concept of competitive freedom is crucial for a critique of bourgeois consciousness. The tendency within Marxism has been to try to show that bourgeois freedom is merely an illusion, that the bourgeois ideals of freedom are never realized, and that these ideals are merely a mask for class domination. Footnote. An aspect of Marx's critique of Proudhon can be seen in Proudhon's demand to simply realize existing bourgeois ideals. Schrader, 1980, writes, quote, "Instead of, from the beginning, positing ideal forms of the bourgeois society against the forms of bourgeois society's bad reality, and wanting to realize them for the first time, or once again, Proudhon, according to Marx, should have posed the question, why must products take on the form of exchange values and humans the form of free and equal rightful persons at all?" End quote. Schrader. Marx treats the forms of equality and freedom prematurely at the level of the simple circulation of commodities in the Grundrisse and following texts on the critique of political economy. End footnote. This tendency finds it hard to accept that there are institutionally guaranteed forms of freedom in bourgeois society, not restricted to the sphere of competition. He further fails to perceive that the mere measuring of empirical reality up against the ideals of bourgeois society leaves the ideal itself uncriticized. In Hegelian language, the reality of bourgeois society may well not correspond to its concept, which can have disastrous consequences for some of its members. But its concept cannot be criticized through this sort of comparison. To be radical, the critique of bourgeois society must be able to criticize it in its concept, so that consciousness will take leave of certain deceptive ideals. Thirdly, it is not the sole task of theoretical critique to reveal the class character of bourgeois society. This adherence of Marx's critique to one aspect of bourgeois reality has rendered it incapable of grasping the whole of the bourgeois social form. It substitutes one contradiction in bourgeois society, which has not been adequately characterized even by Marx himself, for the whole, and when it does not actually ignore other social contradictions, proceeds to subsume the bourgeois world under the schematism of its one critical insight. A variegated dialectical theory would be able to show how the unfreedom of the bourgeois human is perpetrated and perpetuated in and through the bourgeois forms of freedom. Such a theory can open a perspective for consciousness on a conscious, unfetished form of social freedom by breaking the, quote, spell of the totality, end quote. Footnote, Gesellschaft in Adorno. See also Spätkapitalismus oder Industriegesellschaft. End footnote. New section, Section 5, the analysis of the Bourgeois-Democratic state. The objective analysis of Part 4 is the state, firstly as unified social subject standing over against the society of competitive individuals, and secondly as a subject apparently embodying the will of the people. The analysis is to investigate the necessary doubling of society into society and state, so concretizing remarks by the young Marx, and the equally necessary attempt at reconciling this doubling through the constitution of a democratic identity. The guiding thread for this part of the analysis, too, is the concept of bourgeois freedom, but now not restricted to competitive freedom. New forms of freedom and compulsion arise in connection with the mighty subject, the state. The analysis will be an investigation of why bourgeois freedom is inextricably bound to means of physical repression and force. Both the doubling and intimate bonds between freedom and force are forms of appearance of the sundered moments of particularity and abstract universality inaugurated in the value form. This claim can be substantiated only by the whole of the analysis. The form analysis of state presented in the main text has scarcely any resemblance with Marxist theories of state. The further one moves from the beginnings of the analysis in the value theory, the greater the difference between Marxist thinking and a dialectical form analysis. The Marxist theory of state is in a parlous, even scandalous condition. Scarcely any progress has been made in the entire Marxist discussion towards winning a well-grounded concept of state. It has been a matter of elaborating on the notions about the state as set down already in the works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Gramsci. In attempting to construct a critical theory of state from classical sources, the scientificity of the theory has been surrendered. A theory of state must be able to stand on its own feet in order to present an argumentation which would have to be accepted as intersubjectively binding and not merely insightful, for the Marxist who, in any case, mostly proceeds from certain unquestioned postulates. The construction of a state theory cannot be compared with the task of reconstruction of the capital analysis. As we have seen above, 1. Marx's plan for a system of comprising a theory of state remained unexecuted. There exists no elaborated systematic writing of Marx which could be sensibly taken as the raw material for efforts at reconstruction. The writings of the early Marx on state have either polemical character, e.g. against Hegel, from a radical democratic standpoint, or are programmatic in the sense that notions of the alienation of the state from society require for their adequate conceptualization the analysis of economic categories, to which Marx turned only later, with his critique of political economy. In this programmatic sense, the mature Marx fell far behind the young Marx. As early as 1844, in the preface to the economic philosophical manuscripts, Marx announces an even more ambitious project than that planned at the time of writing of the Grundrisse. Decidedly non-economic themes are named. Quote, I will therefore publish successively in different independent brochures the critique of right, morality, politics, etc., and in conclusion try to give the connection of the whole, the relation of the individual parts, as well as, finally, the critique of the speculative treatment of this material. For this reason, in the present work, one finds the connection of national economy with state, right, morality, bourgeois life, etc., only mentioned insofar as national economy itself mentions these objects ex professo. End quote. End quote, Marx. On the other hand, the mature Marx carries out an elaborate realization of at least the first part of a program whose argumentation is well explicated and grounded compared to the early works. Marx's political and historical writings cannot be regarded as having independent scientific philosophical value. They contain certain views of Marx on the state, such as its class nature, which first have to be grounded by a conceptual argumentation, if at all. The Communist Manifesto, written together with Engels, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, and the Civil War in France, possess interest as historical works or in connection with Marx's views on socialist society. Part 4, therefore, will not discuss these texts. The roots of the classical Marxist theory of the state can be found in Engels rather than with Marx. Engels' book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State, must be regarded as the foundation text for all further Marxist views on the state. This work, quickly thrown together in the space of 2 months, during which Engels had visits from friends, suffers from being based on a mythological historical mode of presentation. Sorry, I should say how this actually sentence is typed out specifically. This work, quickly thrown together in the space of 2 months, during which Engels had visited some friends, suffers from being based on a mytho and logical historical mode of presentation rather than a dialectical theory. Historically questionable descriptions stand in for concepts. I was able to learn nothing from this text in my research. The third influential classical source of Marxist theory of state is Lenin's State and Revolution and related text. We are confronted with a text which merely remouths Marx and Engels' views on state, and which therefore forfeits interest from a scientific perspective. Lenin's polemical aim in writing State and Revolution was to beat the revisionist Kautsky et al. Over the head with quotations from Marx and Engels. Faithfulness to the masters is the yardstick of Lenin's critique, not insightful argumentation which could be assessed independently by the reader. The legacy of this incestuous mode of theory formation is the strikingly unsystematic character of the classical Marxist text on state, which goes hand in hand with the adherence to certain dogmatically held, because conceptually ungrounded, ideas about the state. The most important of these is the class nature of the bourgeois state. Even Gramsci, whose genuine innovations in thinking on the state, although systematically speaking chaotic, cannot be gone into here, does not problematize the axiomatic character of the class state. For any systematically argued critical theory of the bourgeois state, we are not interested in developing a general trans-epochal notion of state. The dispute around the Marxist notion of class state, must assume a central position. Quotations from Marx supporting his view cannot decide the dispute one way or the other. The question is not whether the bourgeois state is a sphere of a form of society in which there are social classes, although it is to be noted that the common understanding of social classes constitutes a point of contention in the present work. The question to be settled by form analysis is whether the bourgeois state is to be conceptualized as class state in the sense of an agency of the ruling classes, Ausschuss der herrschenden Klassen. To satisfy the reader's curiosity, it can be said that this latter notion of the state is discarded by form analysis as a piece of pure dogma, useless to anyone trying to give a convincing account of the social form state. The reader interested in what form analysis positively has to offer for a critique of the state is referred to Part 4. We mention only that we do not serve up the old Marxist, not necessarily Marx's, soup one more time, and provide arguments instead which can counter other bourgeois conceptions of the state by showing the grain of truth within them, but not at the cost of sacrificing the critique of value form categories. On the contrary, a successful critique must be able to enter into a dialogue with other views on the state and thereby dissolve them in the systematic argumentation. The senselessness of the confrontation between Marxist and bourgeois theories of state, at least on the Marxist side, can be seen in the failure of the Marxists to self-critically reflect whether, or in which sense, the notion, quote, class state, end quote, can be made a grounded critical category. The concept of state as an instrument of class domination is presented nowhere more unequivocally than with Lenin. Despite all the critique of Leninism in its political form, a reassessment of Lenin's views on the state has not led to any advance on the conceptualization of the state in the Marxist discussion. Like Engels and Marx in his popularizing histomat variant, Lenin poses the problem of state historically rather than conceptually. Quote, the most important thing if one is to approach this question scientifically is not to forget the underlying historical connection, to examine every question from the standpoint of how the given phenomenon arose in history and what were the principal stages of its development, to examine what it has become today, end quote. Lenin. This methodology is firmly in the tradition of the logical historical mode of argumentation, which in the end simply replaces conceptual problems with historical questions as to origins, sequences, and correlations. In the hands of Lenin, this historical approach leads to bone crunching, overbearing orthodoxy where theory is treated as the distillation of a quintessence extracted from historical material. Quote, Engels' book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, is one of the fundamental works of modern socialism, every sentence of which can be accepted with confidence in the assurance, exclamation point, that it has not been said at random, but is based on immense historical and political material, end quote. Lenin. This is nothing other than an invitation to scientific paternalism, an attitude amenable to molding Marxism into a state religion. No wonder, then, that the average Soviet citizen has a stomach full of Marx, and those intellectual refugees from the East who still find something useful in Marx are deeply imbued with a histomat conception. Footnote. The situation is no better in the United States. In a review of Holloway and Picciotto's book, Fay, in 1978, confirms first of all that the American reception of the debate forecloses any serious appreciation of conceptual development. Quote, one reason why the Anglo-American world has always found it hard to get excited about the state derivation debate is the high level of abstraction at which the debate has been conducted. End quote. Fay, 1978. Because of the common assumption of not only British and American audiences, but also the participants in the state derivation debate itself, namely to develop a conceptual apparatus adequate to carry out urgently needed, who sets the deadline, empirical research into concrete historical situations, the elements of the debate which are concerned with, quote, abstract concepts and legal derivations, end quote, are presented as, quote, failing, are presented as a, quote, failing, which lies in the amount of debate that has been devoted to the issue of precisely which concept is the valid point of departure, quote. Fay. Conceptual thinking gets short shrift. Marxist common sense accepts unquestionably that theory is a tool for empirical research, just as in the social sciences. It would be amusing to see someone try to employ the Grundrisse as a, quote, theoretical framework for, quote, empirical research, like hanging a wet dog out to dry on a clothesline. The reader of Marx's main work is invited to stretch his/her imagination. Quote, certainly, Marx never intended, to which letter is Fay referring, Michael Eldred. Capital, to be read as a purely economic analysis. Marx talks of a, quote, critique of economic categories, end quote, Michael Eldred, but rather there's a total analysis of capitalist society, end quote. The project of developing, end quote, Fay. The project of developing a concept of state is, from the start, on the basis of bloody-minded preconceptions, pronounced a stillbirth in the Anglo-American context. Quote, the rigorously logical derivation of the bourgeois state from, quote, capital at its most abstract level will have to be dropped, end quote. Fay. The Germans do indeed have a reputation for being dry and stodgy, and some contributions to the debate in Germany do treat the derivation problem in a formal, logical way. The reader, not hampered with blinkers, however, could discover some more fruitful elements in the debate. The source texts of the debate by Backhaus, Krall, and Reichelt have never received any attention in the Anglophone world. End footnote. The historical mode of argumentation is to assert that where class societies existed, the state has also existed, from which the conclusion can be drawn, voila, quote, the state machine is a machine for the oppression of one class by another, a machine for holding in obedience to one another, one class other, in holding in obedience to one class other subordinated classes, end quote. Lenin. Does this conception capture the character of state? Is anyone to be critically enlightened in the long run by such statements without ossifying into dogmatism? Is the conception of state as, quote, an apparatus of physical coercion, an apparatus of violence, end quote, adequate? It presupposes that the instrument of domination is met by the active resistance of the dominated class. Otherwise, the physical coercion and violence would be only latent. Where the exploited class does not organize its political resistance to the state itself, or to the dominant classes, as in the present period in all bourgeois countries, the Leninist conception of state has an empty ring of revolutionary fervor, appealing only to Trotskyist sects. Lenin's notion of state derives basically from revolutionary periods, from which we today are far removed, which raises the question for a critic of bourgeois society, was tun? What to do. That's what that translates as. The one-sided notion of class domination precludes Lenin from taking bourgeois freedom and equality at all seriously. Quote, all citizens supposedly become equal, end quote, in the bourgeois epoch. Quote, all were regarded as equal before the law irrespective of what capital each owned, end quote. Lenin. The laborer is treated as, quote, a poor man who owns nothing but his labor power, end quote, and at the same time is, quote, possessing no property, end quote, as, quote, propertyless workers, end quote. Lenin. This inconsistency in formulation of the property status of the laborer, an inconsistency running through the entire Marxist literature, indicates a deeper lying misconception of the critique of capitalism. Lenin's emphasis on the propertylessness of the laborers in capitalism allows Lenin to criticize the, quote, illusion of equality under the system of private property. The underlying inequality expresses itself as Lenin emphasizes an ever-new variance, in, quote, a situation in which some gorge while others starve, end quote. Lenin. The critique of capitalism is thus a critique of the gap between rich and poor. Since this injustice should be obvious, even to naive bourgeois consciousness, the task of socialist politics is not so much predicated on a conceptual understanding of the reality which is to be changed, but on political organization around slogans about class oppression and inequality in material wealth and economic power. Those who point out the real abstract formal equality of bourgeois individuals as property owners and the freedom to compete with this private property can only be answered with a demand for, quote, concrete, end quote, equality, and the accusation that they are class enemies of the proletariat. End of the discussion, the revolutionary class struggle begins. No further clarity is striven for about the category of the laborers' freedom of private property in their own bodies. In denying that in the bourgeois epoch the laborers have certain forms of universally valid freedom, the crude view of the state as a, quote, machine for the suppression of some people by others, end quote, Lenin, lies to hand. All other accounts of the state have to be discarded as lies and insidious obfuscations which mask the interests of the capitalist and landowning classes. Lenin is only able to write a dogmatic view of the state which denies the validity to views that take the existing forms of bourgeois freedom seriously, and in spite of this, subject them to critique. Lenin's critique avoids debate on the very issues which would allow him a genuine contestation with his bourgeois revisionist opponents. The problems which Lenin perceives are political rather than theoretical in nature. of the practical propagation of correct and easily understood historical ideas. The question of state is posed by Lenin in a simple either-or manner. Quote, is the state in a capitalist country, in a democratic republic, ... an expression of the popular will, the sum total of the general decision of the people, the expression of the national will, and so forth, or is the state a machine that enables the capitalists of those countries to maintain their power over the working class and the peasantry, end quote. Lenin. The author who exaggeratedly emphasizes the absolute necessity of studying the, quote, whole of Hegel's logic, end quote, to understanding anything of capital, expresses himself here in a somewhat less than dialectical manner. With this either-or logic, a real problematizing of a concept of state is foreclosed once and for all. One can be either a defender of the bourgeoisie or a champion of the proletariat. The critique of the bourgeois state is already encapsulated in its asserted class nature. The tenacity with which Marxism has clung to this view of state, which can say nothing worth mentioning about the contradictoriness of the bourgeois forms of freedom, lies at the core of the impasse at which modern Marxism finds itself. Instead of posing the problem of a critique of state, Marxism has taken the easy way out and fled into the empirical social sciences. An awakening of interest in a theory of the bourgeois superstructure based upon a systematically conceived capital analysis blossomed briefly in the first half of the 70s in the West German Staatsableitung debate. Only relatively late in the piece did English-speaking Marxism come to read about this debate, with the publication of a collection of papers in Holloway and Picciotto, State and Capital, a Marxist debate, published in 1978. In the following pages, the editor's introduction will be discussed in order to show how a German development in theory, which offered at least the prospect of a serious rethinking and consolidation of Marxist theory, has been entirely misused and misinterpreted in the context of British Marxism by selecting those brashly orthodox elements of the debate which can affirm entrenched prejudices. With phrases such as the, quote, limits of the logical, quote, state derivation and, quote, approach, end quote. The fact is masked that the German debate came to no successful execution or even the, quote, first step of its original task, formulated by Holloway and Picciotto as, quote, to, quote, derive the state as a political form from the nature of the capitalist relations of production as a first step towards constructing a materialist theory of the bourgeois state and its development, end quote. Holloway and Picciotto. Even this formulation, which makes a concession to a systematic problematic, treats the, quote, derivation as an irksome prelude to the real task of a, quote, developmental theory. With the ebbing of the student movement, the rollback against Marxist and German universities, and the West German left's farewell to Marx, the occupation with capital analytic theory has become more and more of a curiosity from the perspective of 1984. The year of this preface. The worsening of political conditions reinforced and furthered an inner tendency of the debate to capitulate and dissolve into empirical and historical studies. This does not prevent this dissolution being presented in a thoroughly positive light, not only by British and American Marxists, but also by West German leftists. Footnote, see Gerhard Rudel, 1981. End footnote. To return to our authors, the scare quotes around, quote, derive in the above quoted passage already indicate that Holloway and Picciotto are skeptical about derivation. They make several apologies to the reader with the effect that his/her Anglo-Saxon wariness about a project of systematic derivation is left unshaken, so that in the end form-analysis becomes a vague and empty phrase, signifying a development in theory whose assimilation and truncation by traditional Marxism should pose no insurmountable difficulties. The West German debate never reached any clarity over what, quote, derivation, end quote, means, and thus drew on notions of formal logical deductions on the one hand and of causality on the other. Neither notion offers much at all for the aim of a critique, and it is no wonder that West German Marxists quickly came to the apparent limits of the derivation debate. A logical deduction exhausts itself with analytic conclusions drawn from a prioristic axioms, not exactly the thing to set a critical spirit on fire. The search for causal relations in the time-honored manner of the social sciences seeps very quickly into historical and empirical research. The project of a dialectical theory of the superstructure seems to vaporize before the eyes. The derivationists themselves never came across the idea of critique as phenomenological form analysis. There thus exist some grounds on which Holloway and Picciotto can be excused for their wooden sclerotic representation of derivation, especially when one considers that their contact with the German debate was mediated by Joachim Hirsch. I used to pronounce that Joachim, but I think it's just Joachim. Joachim Hirsch. Their summary of the debate opens with the acquiescing phrase, quote, since the, quote, state derivation and, quote, debate often appears to be so abstract, end quote, and concludes with the calming reassurance, quote, if the reader finds the debate at times too formal and abstract, these criticisms are partly justified, end quote. Holloway and Picciotto. With such remarks, the authors guarantee that the distaste for conceptual thinking will only be reinforced. The three contributors to the book who represent the dissolution and provisional failure of the derivation debate, Hirsch, Gerstenberger, and Braunmühl, are presented as its saviors in that they, quote, raise in different forms the question of the limits of the form analysis of the state, end quote. Footnote, this approval of the dissolution of the derivation debate does not prevent Boris Frankl from including Holloway and Picciotto in his list of the, quote, new generation of derivation theorists, end quote. Boris Frankl. Frankl sees no difference between the various contributions to Holloway and Picciotto's volume and caricatures them as all as derivations, quote, from an analysis of the capital accumulation process, end quote. Frankl shows interest in the question, quote, can one derive an explanation of the widespread oppression of women and blacks which has been present in the very structure and practice of all capitalist and pre-capitalist state apparatuses, end quote. Frankl. As far as I know, no, quote, derivationist, end quote, ever had such Napoleonic delusions of grandeur. The author probably developed an aversion to logic in his maths classes in school days. In spite of the new orthodoxy which quickly precipitated in the West German debate, which Frankl refers to, it was not such a bad thing that they, quote, rediscovered the 3 volumes of Capital, end quote. Frankl laments that a, quote, general analysis such as Capital cannot provide a, quote, political strategy, end quote, and echoes the oft-heard anguished cry for historical specificity. According to the author, a good Marxist should support, quote, women's groups, ecologists, the anti-nuclear movement, numerous national movements such as the Basques, discriminated minorities and races, end quote. Frankl. Frankl regrets only that these movements, quote, have generally been supported by Marxists only after they become mass movements, simply because their existence couldn't be, quote, derived from capital when they were silent or non-existent problems, end quote. Frankl. Frankl can be thankful, at least after these movements have arisen, the Marxist is so busy in solidarity groups that he/she can do nothing but give up the bad habit of trying to derive nuclear reactors and such like from capital. Frankl shows himself to be a well-versed dialectician, quote, a totality is made up of the dialectical relations between the general and the particular, end quote. Because, however, generally speaking, Marxists are so general, preferring to be generals, capital G generals, rather than particulars, they, quote, have tended to ignore the particular, the specific, and derive the particular from the general, end quote. Frankl admits that Marxists also tend to twist their opponents' words in employing unfair polemical tactics. He gets reinforcement from a Sydney colleague who very well could have just finished speaking long distance with Frankl when he writes, quote, what is required in Marxist scholarship is more concrete empirical work, end quote. E. Jones, 1983. More drudgery. I suppose it would keep someone employed. This acquaintance with the concrete empirical should, quote, bring the overly abstract and fragmented theoretical constructions down to earth, and in the process ground the theoretical process in concrete historical detail. Marxists need more exposure to the fine detail of history, both past and present. ... My view is that, in the context of contrary values within the academic community, parenthesis, how right you are, Professor Michael Eldred, in parenthesis, the position has to be constantly reasserted, end quote. Jones, 1983. Jones will find no lack of academic colleagues who are willing to reassert again and again the central tenet of Marxist, or more generally Anglo-Saxon empiricist common sense. Anyone who doesn't hold it is obviously off his/her rockers. Evan Jones would in all probability be deeply disappointed by the present work. End footnote. Why is it that a derivation of state should only be a, quote, first step, end quote? In the construction of a materialist theory of the state, is revealed by the author's idea that an adequate theory must be able to account for the historical development of the bourgeois state. They criticize Blanca, Jurgens, and Kastendijk, all these pieces, by the way, are on this channel, for making a, quote, rigid distinction between form analysis and a historical analysis, end quote. Quote, the actual history of the development of state functions and state institutions is therefore something which has somehow to be added after the logical derivation has been completed, end quote. Quote, it is hard to see how an adequate form analysis can be anything other than historical, end quote. Here we have it. The derivation, conceived as a form analysis, collapses into history because any alternative is, quote, hard to see, end quote. Over 100 years of Marxism is a support for this statement. Backhaus's pioneering work, which aims at a radical shake-up of Marxism, should have made Holloway and Picciotto a little circumspect in methodological and reconstructive questions concerning Marx's writings. They cite Backhaus's early article without showing any evidence whatever of having learnt anything from him. They refer unproblematically to Marx's, quote, derivation of the money form from the contradictions of the commodity, end quote. Although it is precisely this derivation which has been problematized by Backhaus. Footnote. Backhaus's first article already cast doubt on the success of Marx's form analysis. More detailed discussions of the same problems, among other things, are contained in the Materialien. On the problem of the relation between historical and logical moments, see especially Materialien 3 and 4, now in Hans-Georg Backhaus, Dialekt der Wertform, Untersuchungen zur Marxischen Ökonomiekritik, published in 1997 with Sa Ira, and Backhaus 1981. Reichelt, whose name is associated with Backhaus as founder of the so-called Capital Logic School, cannot be regarded as having consistently followed a program of logical reconstruction of Marxist theory. His critique of Flatov and Huisken, which is on this channel, for instance, reveals that logical and historical elements for him still mixed together. End footnote. The conception of a, quote, derivation from, quote, contradictions in the commodity, end quote, only makes sense as a logical dialectical transition. In the light of the critical German literature on the subject, which is accessible to the authors, the naivety with which they regurgitate Engels' vulgar view on method is nothing less than astounding. Even the famous methodological remarks by Marx in the introduction to the Grundrisse, which at least partially contradict the Engelsian conception, are not cited. Holloway and Picciotto conceal the fragmentary character of Marx's Capital when they insist that, quote, the task is not to develop, quote, political concepts to complement the set of, quote, economic concepts, but to develop the concepts of Marx's Capital in the critique not only of the economic, but also of the political forms of social relations, end quote. Holloway and Picciotto. The conceptual structure, according to the authors, is already complete and requires merely an extension of application of the categories of Marx's Capital to the, quote, political form of social relations, end quote. Whereas Palancis produces notions to grasp the specificity of the political, but without providing any mediation with a capital analysis, Holloway and Picciotto bend the stick entirely the other way in proposing that the capital analysis already contains the categories necessary, quote, to illuminate the structure of class conflict in capitalist society and the form and conceptions, economic and otherwise, generated by that structure, end quote. Holloway and Picciotto. With respect to systematic analysis, the author's view is that not only is the Marxian capital analysis in no need of reconstruction, but also that no autonomous systematic extension is required to grasp the superstructure. If this were so, one could only be dumbfounded as to what the objective of the state derivation debate ever was. The authors claim that this debate is viewed, quote, the categories elaborated in Marx's Capital, parentheses, surplus value accumulation, etc., parentheses, ... not as being specific to the analysis of the, quote, economic level, end quote. End quote. Holloway and Picciotto. From such a reductionist standpoint, nothing more than reduction could be achieved. A grotesque subsumption of superstructural categories under economic categories, which could only reinforce the worst suspicions gladly set abroad by anti-Marxists about Marxism's economism. By treating Hirsch's contribution to the debate most kindly, the authors concur with the former's economism, expressed in banning the consideration of the state as an object requiring its own concept, and which therefore cannot be grasped in terms of economic categories. Footnote. Hirsch substitutes the problem of conceptual development of the state form with an assertion, quote, the fundamental form determination of the bourgeois state, namely the doubling of bourgeois society into society and state, and the formal particularization of the state as an administrative apparatus separated from society, cannot be derived out of the abstraction of isolated structural elements, but requires an analysis of the social production process and the laws determining it in its totality, end quote. Joachim Hirsch, 1974. A conceptual problematic is passed over in favor of historico-empirical research. Quote, the investigation of the capitalist process of accumulation and crisis therefore forms the central foundation of a historically concretized state analysis, end quote. Hirsch. Down with philosophy, exclamation point. Long live sociology, exclamation point. back to the end footnote. This is apparent in the authors repeatedly encapsulate their view of form analysis as a demonstration of the, quote, relation between the state and the contradictions of capitalist accumulation, end quote. That the problem of a form-analytic concept of state is not comprehended. The solution of a problem is often simultaneous with its posing. In the headlong rush to a theory of development is indicated by the slide from mention of the, quote, state form to the, quote, changing forms of state, end quote. The dialectical speculative task of developing a concept of the bourgeois state is substituted by the historiographical task of accounting for different historically defined forms of state. The concept of, quote, form, in the singular and plural usage of the word, have two entirely different, unrelated meanings. The latter has little relevance in a dialectical critique, and that restricted exclusively to historical illustrations employed to elucidate conceptual categories. Despite the approving reference to the German debate's form considerations as a way out of the, quote, rather infertile rut of the Miliband-Palancis debate, end quote. The criticisms made of Miliband, Palancis, and Gramsci owe nothing to form-analytic considerations in the sense outlined in Section 3 above, but rather to Holloway and Picciotto's opinion of how an adequate theory of state should look. Quote, first, they are unable to analyze the development of political forms. Note the plural, parenthesis, note the plural, Michael Eldred, in parenthesis. Secondly, they are unable to analyze systematically the limitations imposed on the state by the relation of the state to the process of capital accumulation. End quote. Holloway and Picciotto. The first criterion is historical. The second concerns the economic functions of state, not the state's form. The author's incomprehension of the program of form analysis as a dialectical theory is to be noted that Backhaus's early article was decisive in opening the derivation debate. It is understandable in the background of their conception of the relation between capitalist economy and state as one of causality and functionality, rather than as a dialectical reflections best among, arrived at through the consideration of contradictions. In 2 and 3 above, we have hinted at characteristics of a dialectical form analysis which must seem strange to Anglo-Saxon eyes. One can be sure that such hints hit a nerve center which provokes a sharp, unreflected Pavlovian response. The search, however, is rather for the Archimedean point. Holloway and Picciotto only managed to find a suitable dustbin for the derivation debate by referring euphemistically to the evaporation of form analysis as, quote, the limitations of form analysis have become clear, end quote. Holloway and Picciotto. New section. Having come this far, the reader is posed with the decision as to whether to proceed to the heavier going stuff of a conceptual development. I put in some rasping jokes and mischievous ironical remarks to ease the way. No compromises have been made with the temptation to popularize by vulgarizing the conceptual development. A century of Marxism has shown that nothing is to be gained by way of popularization. When the point of the critique becomes thereby irretrievably lost, it will be comfortable to delude oneself that in the hurly-burly of politics, the finer points of theory do not make much difference. Alternatively, one could throw one's hands into the air and exclaim, quote, if the masses are expected to plow their way through these dialectics, then we may as well give up now, end quote. That, however, would be to put the cart before the horse. In the first place, it is only the present reader who is posed with this decision. It would be appropriate to pose the question of what to do with a dialectical knowledge only after that dialectical knowledge has been won. If the presentation has been at all successful, the world should look a little different then. The reader will have to be prepared to grapple with some reconstructed Hegelian categories. which presupposes that the reader hold his/her anti-Hegelian prejudices provisionally in abeyance. The Hegelian categories are not to be bandied around like advertising slogans, as happened with Althusserian terminology in the 70s. No apology is made for the demand that the concepts be thought through according to the rules of the systematic dialogue. It has become a customary obeisance in English-speaking Marxism to at first embarrass oneself when presenting, quote, abstract theory, end quote. Hegel's question, quote, who thinks abstractly, end quote, if pursued, would lead to the paradoxical result that those who pride themselves on being intimately in contact with the empirical concrete are in fact the most abstract thinkers in the worst sense of the word. This kind of paradox is familiar to dialectical thinking under the concept, quote, inversion, Umkehrung. For the reader whose curiosity has succeeded in awakening, I promise some dialectical surprises. Okay. So we have reached the end of all the prefaces and the synopses of Critique of Competitive Freedom and the Bourgeois-Democratic State, outline of a form-analytic extension of Marx's uncompleted system. Thank you so much for listening. Didn't realize I hadn't stopped recording.